Chapter 442. Yishuan entered the microcosm, and saw a young man inside. He appeared to be in his 20s. He was clad in a yellowish-orange robe. He looked a bit arrogant. The principles were looming over his body. Yishuan counted, and found out that there were 999 Tao principles on his body. Yishuan also noticed that his aura was a bit unstable. This clearly meant that he must have made a breakthrough very recently. This level of strength was sufficient to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert. However, he wasn't present in the known lineup of Heaven's Pride experts. This showed that he hadn't cultivated till half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. However, he had still managed to condense 999 Tao principles even though he hadn't reached the half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. This was nothing less than a small miracle. This must have some relation with the power technique that he had practiced. Immortal Hell King's Rebirth Scripture. Yishuan didn't know what kind of a power technique it was. He could have asked Yimo about it. However, Yimo was in deep slumber at the moment. Therefore, he had lost contact with Yimo. However, even Yimo might not know about it. After all, they're used to so many sages in the ancient times. So, the number of power techniques created by them was as many as the stars in the sky. It was obviously impossible for someone to know about all of them. You are Yishuan. Sun Zhanpeng wasn't afraid, nor did he show any signs of fear when he saw Yishuan. In fact, he seemed a bit excited on the contrary. Yes, excited. And, Yishuan could clearly see this from his facial expression. He wasn't excited to meet his opponent. Rather, he was excited with the fact that he would soon become famous. Yes, I am. Yishuan casually replied. I hadn't thought that I would meet you here like this. I'm very excited. Sun Zhanpeng burst into laughter and said, You may not know how famous you are in our Xian Yuan Palace Hall. I will be acknowledged as someone worthy of being a Heaven's Pride expert as long as I can kill you. And, I will fill up the position left vacant by Fan Ming if that happens. You'd better watch out. And, don't underestimate my strength. Sun Zhanpeng continued to speak. He seemed like a person who had been longing for recognition for a long time. And, he had suddenly become excited since he had been presented with such an opportunity. Idiot. Yishuan opened his mouth, and spat out this word. What did you say? Sun Zhanpeng got angry, a person like you won't understand. How can someone like you understand my thought process? A person like you must die. Hell King's Disaster Blade. Sun Zhanpeng shouted. An immeasurable demonic aura emerged out from his body. The entire 999 Tao principles on his body began to boil, and started to flutter in the sky. It seemed as if every Tao principle could crush an ordinary semi-sage expert to death. He had claimed to have the strength to beat Yishuan. And, his claim wasn't entirely false either. He genuinely possessed tyrannical strength. In fact, it was enough to make him a ranked Heaven's Pride expert. Yishuan had heard someone say that Sun Zhanpeng wasn't this ferocious in the past. However, he had recently taken a rebirth. So, his strength had advanced by leaps and bounds. In fact, it had increased enough to place him in the ranks of Heaven's Pride experts. Moreover, he had been enraged by Yishuan only moments ago. So, he had attacked in rage. One could well imagine his strength. Endless black clouds shrouded the sky in an instant, and cold winds began to blow around like astral winds. Sun Zhanpeng brandished his long blade. He appeared like an ancient god. It seemed as if he was an ancient god of death, and the tip of his blade carried certain death. In fact, it seemed as if innumerable souls were angrily howling at the tip of his blade. Sun Zhanpeng's long blade transformed into a 100-feet-long blood blade in the void. It carried boundless negative energy as it swept towards Yishuan. It slashed down upon Yishuan, and it seemed as if it would cleave him into two. Yishuan suddenly took a step as boundless golden light emitted from his body, and propelled him forward. He managed to avoid this terrifying blade attack. Crash! the long black ferociously smashed on the ground. It crushed the surface, and opened a hundreds of feet long, massive crack. It was extremely deep and scary in make. Ha! Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. He transformed into a golden streamer, and instantly arrived in front of Sun Zhanpeng. It's over now. You're too naive. Sun Zhanpeng's face exposed a sinister look. Seemingly endless negative energy condensed on top of his long blade. It took the shape of a sharp arrow, and went blazing towards Yi Shiwen. Whoosh! This long arrow made of negative energy cut across the vast sky. It shattered the space, and nearly struck its target, Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen jumped, and avoided this sharp arrow. Sun Zhanpeng brandished his 100 feet long and dreadful, great blade, towards Yi Shiwen to chop him down once again. It cracked the space to reveal the void on the other side, and shook the ninth heaven. Yi Shiwen's pupils contracted. This great blade was actually a sage tool. So, its power was infinite. Moreover, it seemed as if Sun Zhanpeng's martial art was compatible with this sage tool. An attack made from a sage tool was obviously going to possess endless might. There was a difference of heaven and earth between a pseudo-sage tool and a sage tool. It was like the difference between the semi-sage realm and sage realm. In fact, an attack unleashed from a sage tool would carry endless might even if it hadn't been used by a sage expert. The spectators who were watching this fight from the outside also recognized this sage tool. And, they were left shocked at this discovery. Only a top-notch expert could possess a sage tool. The dreadful might of this sage tool had also left them incredibly shocked. Something like a pseudo-sage tool was considered a legendary item in their eyes. Let alone a sage tool. In fact, several sage experts were still using pseudo-sage tools. The long blade smashed down at a very fast speed. Bang! The entire space exploded and shattered into small pieces. The faces of many people had turned pale with fear. The dreadful might of this sage tool had left them to gasp in admiration. It wasn't surprising that Sun Zhanpeng was so arrogant and despotic. After all, he possessed such a dreadful weapon. Nobody was optimistic about him in the beginning. His strength might have been catching up to that of a Heaven's Pride expert. However, the man in front of him had already killed 2 Heaven's Pride experts, and had effortlessly defeated one more in the past. However, everything changed when Sun Zhanpeng used a sage tool. The unexpected appearance of this sage tool was enough to reverse the situation. Yi Shiwen, you will die today. Sun Zhanpeng sneered and spoke. He was gasping heavily for breath. A sage tool was certainly very powerful. However, using it also resulted in great consumption of energy. He had reached the peak of the semi-sage realm. However, it wasn't enough for him to continue its usage for a long time. He had merely brandished it twice, and had already begun to pant heavily. Yi Shiwen's figure appeared in the void. His golden wings stretched out behind his body for several feet. He began to stroll in the void. He was clad in golden divine clothes, and appeared just like a god. His vision had turned cold. The fighting intention was clearly visible in his eyes. Then, an endless amount of sword intention condensed into a long sword in his hand. Yi Shiwen, I will give you an opportunity to die in a dignified way. Sun Zhanpeng laughed out loud. He was laughing in such a hysterical manner that he looked a little crazed. He was very pleased with himself. The feelings which had remained restrained for a long time had finally begun to seethe about in a crazy manner. He had gone completely mad as a result. He had been under pressure for many years. Why? Why are those Heaven's Pride experts aloof from the rest of the world? As if they are looking down on the world, as if they are gods. Just like this Yi Shiwen is. So, he loathed Yi Shiwen, and wanted to destroy him. He wanted to use his long blade to kill these so-called Heaven's Pride experts, and prove that he was more powerful than them. He wanted to prove that those Heaven's Pride experts were like trash in front of him, that's all. He hated this world. He hated it for not being able to understand and appreciate his talent. You're insane. Yi Shiwen indifferently said. Yes. I am insane. You people have forced me to be like this. You Heaven's Pride experts are nothing. You are nothing. Sun Zhanpeng laughed out loud crazily as he replied. Yi Shiwen looked solemn. He understood Sun Zhanpeng's mindset. There were several Heaven's Pride experts in this world, and everyone else grew up under the shadow of these Heaven's Pride experts. However, Yi Shiwen didn't argue with him as to whether he was right or wrong. Sun Zhanpeng had plunged to the depths of extreme delusion. Yi Shiwen had never considered himself as a Heaven's Pride expert, nor had he ever thought that they were insurmountable. In fact, he didn't consider himself to be the Heaven's favorite child like those other Heaven's Pride experts did. He didn't possess outstanding talent like they did. He also hadn't possessed an exceptional body foundation since birth. He had to struggle for everything that he possessed today. In fact, he wouldn't have his current strength if he hadn't risked his life countless times. I know you can't brandish that great blade of yours several times. I could simply exhaust you to death if I wanted to. But, I wanted to give you an opportunity to understand the real difference in our strengths. Yi Shiwen spoke up in a cold voice. That great blade had grown very big after absorbing the demonic negative energies of the dead people. This kind of a sage tool demanded a lot from its wielder. It could even devour its owner if there was a rebound. Ha ha ha. I hate the way you think you're so self-righteous. Sun Zhanpeng laughed in a hysterical manner. In fact, he now hated Yi Shiwen as much as he hated those other Heaven's Pride experts combined. He got even crazier when he saw a trace of pity in Yi Shiwen's eyes. He didn't need someone's pity. He didn't want sympathy. He would rather kill those who'd dare to sympathize with him. Bang! Sun Zhanpeng unleashed his ominous power. It was quite dreadful. The energy of the dead emerged out of his body. The souls of countless dead people began to howl as they gathered and condensed into two terrifying blood-red eyes behind his body. He aimed the long blade in his hand at Yi Shiwen, and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. He broke the void with his steps. He was undoubtedly a lone person, but his imposing aura appeared similar to that of a cavalry of thousands of ghost soldiers. You think too highly of yourself, take this move. Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. The golden divine beams blossomed from his body. His entire body became golden. This could have ranked him among the gods. Then, he brandished his long sword. Buried Heaven's sword. Clang! Yi Shiwen's long sword began to spin in his palm in a crazed manner. It gradually turned into a cyclone of energy, and swept out. It began to rotate even more crazily as it obscured the entire sky. Many disciples of Legendary Realm were watching this fight from a different space, they couldn't even see the figures of these two. This was a peerless counterattack. The long blade and the long sword suddenly collided. Bang! The space shattered into small pieces, just like glass. The massive energy waves overflowed the sky, and swept in all directions. The chaos leaked out. And, the killing intention flooded the entire space. Bang! A loud noise was emanated as a result of the collision. A figure went flying out from the inexhaustible cyclone. Chapter 443. A terrifying cyclone swept out in all directions. The entire microcosm was nearly shattered into small pieces by this frightening cyclone. A chill ran inside the hearts of the spectating disciples. Everyone was in extreme shock, and their hair stood on end with fear. This level of fighting strength was extremely terrifying. Not to mention that this was merely semi-sage level strength. It would have been an extremely dreadful scene if the strength of the contenders had been at the level of the sage realm. Such a terrifying battle could only take place between two Heaven's Pride experts. All Heaven's Pride experts were brilliant and outstanding. However, only one among them could carry forward his glory till the end, and win the trophy. Therefore, every big force would always try to reduce the unnecessary collisions between Heaven's Pride experts. In fact, Several Heaven's Pride experts of the semi-sage realm had never clashed with each other even once. This was done to ensure that these Heaven's Pride experts grew up smoothly. After all, the semi-sage realm was only the beginning. This was the fiercest battle between the experts of younger generations so far. It had already touched the peak of the semi-sage realm. A violent energy storm had swept out in all directions in an instant. The entire space had been shattered into pieces, like a glass. The massive energy waves had overflowed the sky, and had swept in all directions. The chaos had leaked out from the other side, while the killing intention had flooded the entire space. Bang! A loud noise was heard as a figure was sent flying out from the inexhaustible cyclone. Everyone's gazes fell on the figure that had come flying out the cyclone. It was Sun Jianpeng. Some people had guessed correctly that it might be Sun Jianpeng. However, they were still taken aback. Everyone had anticipated that Sun Jianpeng wouldn't be able to prevail over Yi Shiwen when the contest had begun. However, everyone had started to believe that he might be able to beat Yi Shiwen after he had taken out a sage tool. However, their prediction had again turned wrong since it was Yi Shiwen who stood victorious. Sun Jianpeng went flying across the sky, and crashed into a mountain. He lost his consciousness thereafter. It wasn't clear whether he was dead or alive. That inexhaustible cyclone tore the entire microcosm to pieces. The pieces of space debris then scattered in the dark chaos. Yi Shiwen's figure became visible the very next moment. Yi Shiwen's entire body was covered with golden divinities at this moment. The divinities were boiling, and made it seem like he was clad in golden and divine clothes. He appeared like a god. True Martial University's Yi Shiwen wins this fight. The referee passed the judgment after he had verified that Sun Jianpeng had lost the ability to fight further. Several disciples couldn't believe this. Just one move again. Yi Shiwen had defeated a formidable expert of the rank of Heaven's Pride experts in just one move. Yi Shiwen had used just one move throughout the fight, and had defeated his opponent in a convincing manner. How tyrannical was this Yi Shiwen? People simply weren't able to digest this fact. Some of the Heaven's Pride experts were stronger, while some were weaker. Everyone was aware of this fact. However, how could there exist such a huge disparity among them? The match had been settled in one move. This level of disparity had pushed everyone in despair. How's this possible? Sun Jianpeng is as powerful as a Heaven's Pride expert. However, he couldn't withstand a single blow while facing Yi Shiwen. He got defeated in one move in merely one move. Is the disparity between these Heaven's Pride experts genuinely so wide? It's truly unbelievable. Now, I genuinely don't know who among Yi Shiwen, Emperor Chen, and the Twin Stars brothers is stronger. Sun Jianpeng was definitely the biggest dark horse in this time's competition. However, he appeared so weak in front of Yi Shiwen. How can there be such a big gap between them? This is unbelievable. Everyone was in shock after having witnessed this outcome. It seemed as if they had seen some kind of miracle. However, they didn't know that Yi Shiwen's strength had already surpassed the pinnacle of the semi-sage realm. He had already condensed 1,000 Tao principles. So, his strength had increased several times as compared to what it used to be. In fact, it could be said that his current strength was on a whole new level. But, Sun Jianpeng had only reached the level of Heaven's Pride experts. In fact, he was a bit weaker than Pang Yangbo and those others from before. Yi Shiwen would have killed him in one slap if he hadn't possessed that sage tool, the Great Blade. It was impossible for him to affect Yi Shiwen in any way. Yi Shiwen came out of the microcosm, and landed on the ground. The nearby space suddenly distorted, and broke into pieces. Then, the broken space fragments fell on the surface of the metropolis Martial Peak. A figure flew out from the space debris. Yi Shiwen wondered, who has made such a fierce attack that the space itself has been broken into pieces. Yi Shiwen suddenly shot a glance at that figure, and saw that it was Xueyan Luo. Yes, it was Xueyan Luo. The innerwear armor which was given to her by Yi Shiwen had been shattered. She looked tired and feeble. Her bones had been shattered. She was panting heavily. Bang! A burst of power, which was a blend of water and fire, swept out from that microcosm. A huge tornado of fire and water surged towards Shui Yen Luo. It was advancing straight towards her in order to kill her. How could Yi Shiwen allow that to happen? He shouted loudly. Clang! A long sword appeared in his hand out of nowhere. It was then raised up in the sky. It transformed into a hundreds of feet long sword in the void, and slashed down towards that huge tornado to crush it. Rumble! That massive tornado was annihilated by the irresistible force of that long sword. Xian Yuan twin stars. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth. His eyes turned cold. He looked like an enraged wild beast. Who has dared to interfere in our matter? The twin stars brothers suddenly came out through the crack in the space. Was it you? The twin stars brothers asked in unison. Ha ha ha. This is the fate of those who oppose our Xian Yuan Palace Hall. You will die. Even the people around you will die. They suddenly broke into a wild laughter as they said. As expected, they had resorted to extreme methods because of Yi Shiwen. That was visible from the serious injuries on her body. She would have died if Yi Shiwen hadn't given her that innerwear armor. Yi Shiwen restrained his anger, and walked towards Shui Yen Luo. He said, You two are lucky. You should be glad that you're still alive. Pray that you don't come across me. I will make you die a miserable death if you do. This was the first time that Yi Shiwen had felt such strong, killing intention for someone. He was burning with anger because of these two individuals' despicable nature. Shui Yen Luo was as insignificant as an ant on the ground to them. They could smash a group of ants any time by stepping on them. And they wouldn't feel anything about it. However, the same wasn't true in Yi Shiwen's case. Dream on, the twin stars brothers' complexions changed. Yi Shiwen's words had made them extremely furious. Nobody had ever dared to talk to them like that. Especially when they felt that they hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, they felt that Yi Shiwen should be grateful to them since they had allowed him to live for a few days. However, he had dared to threaten them instead. Yi Shiwen ignored the twin stars brothers, and walked up to Shui Yen Luo to help her heal. She had sustained very serious injuries. However, it was nothing for Yi Shiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique. Yi Shiwen had sustained even more serious injuries than hers in the past. His injuries had been more serious, and he had been left to hang on the last few breaths. He was merely at half-step legendary realm at that time. And he had been chased by a semi-sage expert. That situation was far more dangerous than Shui Yen Luo's present one. The twin stars brothers flew in a rage when they saw that Yi Shiwen hadn't paid attention to them. However, they couldn't attack in any case. They knew where they were at the moment. So, they had no choice but to leave with a bitter taste in their mouths. Yi Shiwen used the field effect of the Phoenix regeneration technique to treat Shui Yen Luo rather quickly. The ruddy expression slowly came back to her face. Her complexion no longer looked pale, and she slowly regained consciousness. Brother Yi, thanks a lot. Shui Yen Luo thanked him. She couldn't put the feeling of gratitude she that had in her heart for Yi Shiwen in mere words. She would have died if Yi Shiwen hadn't given her that armor. How did this happen? Didn't you admit defeat? Yi Shiwen asked. He had told her to surrender since he knew that the twin stars brothers might resort to extreme methods. However, he hadn't expected that they would succeed in doing that. They are too cruel. I surrendered as soon as I went inside, just as you had told me. However, they still attacked me. Shui Yen Luo's face exposed extreme anger. Yi Shiwen, you must avenge me, and kill them. Shui Yen Luo spoke up angrily. She would have been dead by now if she hadn't worn Yi Shiwen's innerwear armor. Those two had almost succeeded in killing her. Therefore, it was only natural that she hated them from the bottom of her heart. Don't worry. They won't get away. They will die this time. Yi Shiwen replied in a cold voice. only one party would live, either him or those twin stars brothers. The killing intention had become incomparably intense in his heart. Yi Shiwen took Shui Yen Luo to the base of the mountain after she had recovered. After all, only winners were permitted to stay in this public square. Losers were sent away to some other place. And Shui Yen Luo wasn't an exception either. Yi Shiwen returned to the public square. The 7th round had ended by then. Therefore, the disciples in the entire public square were excited to discuss about the upcoming 8th round. That was because 2 heavyweight disciples were likely to face each other in the 8th round: the True Martial University's Qin Wang and East Sea's Emperor Chen. These 2 individuals had been Heaven's Pride experts for a long time. They would finally face each other in the next round. Yi Shiwen had defeated Sun Zhanpeng in the previous round. And Sun Zhanpeng's fighting strength was equal to that of a Heaven's Pride expert. However, he was known to all as a barely Heaven's Pride expert. However, Qin Wang and Emperor Chen were different. They had been famous for several years. Moreover, they were considered as top elites in their respective forces. One could say that the competition for this time's championship would take place between 8 individuals. And only one among these 8 individuals would win this time's competition. However, nobody had thought that 2 of them would face each other in the 8th round itself. This would be a stunning battle for sure. Other fights of this round would look dull in front of this battle. So, everyone's focus was bound to be fixed on this battle. Chapter 444. Qin Wang and Emperor Chen are finally going to face each other. Perhaps we'll be able to see an interesting showdown this time. Neither of these individuals is a simple personality. Emperor Chen had once defeated 2 Heaven's Pride experts at the same time. He is known as the undisputed king in the East Sea. Gee, he's so courageous. Qin Wang isn't an ordinary person either. Do you know why he's known as Qin Wang? This title was given to him because once he had wiped out a small country by himself in order to increase the territory of his own country. Some people knew him as Qin Wang the King. They addressed him as King whenever he would pass by. Everyone suddenly gasped. Wiped out a small country on his own. It was merely a small country. However, even a small country in the true martial world had a population of at least 10 million people. Then, how many experts that small country might have had? And he had annihilated all of them by himself. He was definitely very powerful and ferocious. Neither of these 2 individuals was easy to deal with. So, their clash would obviously be a startling collision. Even Yi Shiwen was very interested in the battle of these 2 individuals. It didn't matter whether Qin Wang had annihilated a small country or Emperor Chen had simultaneously defeated 2 Heaven's Pride experts. One thing was clear, that none of these 2 individuals was an ordinary person. Their battle would shake the heavens. However, the most important thing for him was to cross the 8th round of the competition as early as possible. These other things didn't matter to him. He should be able to settle this round rather quickly if the opponent didn't turn out to be a Heaven's Pride expert of the rank of Emperor Chen. He could come out, and would have enough time to watch Emperor Chen's fight if he was able to win the round quickly enough. The 8th round of the competition began soon. This was today's 2nd round. There were fewer participants in today's competition as compared to the total number of participants in the last 2 days. In fact, it was just a tiny portion of the first day's number. Yi Shiwen entered the competition space for his fight. A young expert was waiting for him inside the microcosm. He was a top expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. So, he was obviously outstanding. However, there was a big disparity between him and a Heaven's Pride expert. He surrendered as soon as he saw Yi Shiwen. He wasn't a coward. But he could see the reality. Yi Shiwen had defeated Sun Zhanpeng, a man who was close to the rank of a Heaven's Pride expert, at a lightning speed. So, he was aware of the disparity between him and Yi Shiwen. He knew that he couldn't be Yi Shiwen's match. True Martial University's Yi Shiwen wins this fight. Nobody was surprised to see this result. After all, Not many individuals had the courage to compete with such a ferocious Heaven's Pride expert. Yi Shiwen came out of his microcosm, and entered a subspace from where several spectators had gathered to watch the most anticipated fight. This fight had just begun. Countless disciples present around him were talking about this matter. One of the contenders belonged to the East Sea, where Emperor Chen was revered as the undisputed king. Another contender had come from the southern region, where his opponent had exterminated a small country. Everyone was very excited to see these two individuals. Emperor Chen was sitting on a tall and robust-looking golden lion. He was clad in dark red armor. It wasn't a well-known armor, yet it was exuding traces of sage power that scared everyone. They felt a sense of urgency, as if they had been cornered. He was holding a long spear in his hand. And it was pointed forward. It was decorated with ancient symbols. It was evidently an ancient weapon of some big force. It had wandered from person to person over the ages, and had finally fallen into the hands of Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen began to advance slowly. He seemed like a devil god riding a strange and ancient golden beast. Qin Wang was sitting atop an incomparably elegant and divine steed. He didn't show any weakness in front of Emperor Chen. He was clad in a black armor, and his head was covered with a mask. People couldn't see his face because of the mask. He was holding a lance in his hand. His eyes looked ice-cold. These two individuals are so ferocious that even their imposing auras can suffocate people to death, a person exclaimed. Several people held their breaths in amazement. Their eyes were fixed on these two individuals. They couldn't help but be involuntarily affected by the terrifying imposing auras of these two individuals. Everyone was secretly asking oneself whether they could be an opponent of these two individuals. However, nobody dared to say that they could be. Qin Wang and Emperor Chen were very powerful. Both of them were extremely ferocious. They were well-known figures among the Heaven's Pride experts. They were one step away from entering the Sage Realm. Many of the spectators who had come to see their fight trembled in fear. Even Yi Shiwen's complexion slowly sank a bit. He believed Emperor Chen to be his biggest opponent. And there was a possibility that Emperor Chen might lose this fight. The best outcome would be that both of them mutually wounded each other before the fight ended. However, it probably wouldn't affect Emperor Chen's fighting strength by much. That was because Yi Shiwen and these other experts who had reached such a high level were bound to have some incredible sage-level healing technique. These healing techniques might not be as good as Phoenix regeneration technique. However, they would be sufficient to restore the injuries quite quickly. I'm giving you a choice. Surrender or die. Emperor Chen announced in a cold voice. He merely spoke 2 sentences. But that had been enough to shock everyone. Emperor Chen looked cold and decisive, just like a god. Surrender or die. Who could have dared to talk to Qin Wang like this except him? Anyways, Qin Wang was a top Heaven's Pride expert. So, it wasn't easy to defeat him either. Not to mention that such an arrogant provocation wasn't going to work on him. You're insane. But it doesn't matter. I've met crazier people. And they've all been turned into ghosts by my lance. Qin Wang opened his mouth and proclaimed. His voice sounded as if it was coming out of a closed jar. It was because of the mask he was wearing. So, there was no way to identify his real voice. Qin Wang hadn't showed any weakness in front of the arrogant Emperor Chen. Instead, he had threatened Emperor Chen to turn him into a ghost. How many people possessed such boldness? It seems that you have chosen to die. Many people like you have misread these situations. Emperor Chen coldly replied. His eyes had turned cold. It seemed as if he could see right through Qin Wang's mask. It seemed as if his sword-like sharp vision could see beyond his proud face, absorb his soul, and then sever his pride as well. Emperor Chen moved, and his golden lion also moved along with him. It carried Emperor Chen like a small mountain, and advanced towards Qin Wang to crush him. A tyrannical aura swept out of his body, and surged across like ocean waves. So strong. Everyone was shocked by this scene. No opponent had been able to compel Emperor Chen to such an extent in the past. In fact, no one had managed to withstand even a single move of his. He would always beat his opponents very quickly. However, Qin Wang was completely different. He had spoken such insulting words to Emperor Chen. Yet, Emperor Chen's actions clearly indicated that he was giving significant importance to Qin Wang. Yi Shiwen's complexion turned serious. Emperor Chen deserved Yi Shiwen's attention. He truly possessed extremely tyrannical strength. A person would be scared to death while facing his imposing aura if they didn't possess enough strength. Is this all you've got? Qin Wang shouted angrily. Endless, killing intention swept out of his body. One could vaguely hear the complaints and grievances of countless crying souls. Of course, these were the souls of the experts who belonged to that small country he had wiped out. It seemed as if they were complaining about something. However, they were merely fluttering about in the sky as souls. Rumble, the long spear and the lance ferociously collided in that split second. The sound of the terrifying collision of metals exploded. The collision produced endless sparks. These sparks then spattered in all directions. These sparks seemed ordinary, but were simply inexhaustible. They burnt the space where they went. The burnt space then broke into small pieces. It was like a mirror had been ruptured from the middle, and had started to appear like a spider's web, densely packed, and extending along all sides. Clang! The space couldn't endure such a collision, and smashed into pieces. It produced crisp metallic sounds. The void was exposed as the space was smashed into pieces. Everyone was dumbstruck, and held their breaths. A chill ran inside everyone. These two individuals were extremely ferocious. This was such an incredible attack. Wasn't it similar to the attack of those twin stars brothers a while ago, the one that had broken the space into pieces? Everyone was extremely terrified. It was indeed a terrible scene, but had been very much a possibility since both these individuals were tyrannical enough to be ranked as the top experts in their realm. Not to mention that they were clashing against each other right now. Ha 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 ha. Emperor Chen laughed callously. His fighting intention had become stronger. In fact, it had started to seethe. His imposing aura had become even more formidable. It seemed as if Qin Wang had obtained his approval of being a deserving opponent. Qin Wang's complexion looked extremely grave and stern. There wasn't any trace of arrogance in his eyes. The golden lion on which Emperor Chen was seated faced upwards, and let out a long and loud roar. Then, a dreadful aura swept out in all directions. Everyone was scared by this golden lion's aura. The golden lion had condensed 999 Tao principles, just like any other top expert. This shocked everyone. This golden lion could be compared with a top heaven's pride expert. So, it wasn't surprising that Emperor Chen didn't pay any attention to the Twin Stars brothers. The Twin Stars brothers would be merely equal to two Heaven's Pride experts if they joined hands. However, Emperor Chen and his mount would be equal to two top-tier Heaven's Pride experts if they fought together. Who could resist such a team? How did this golden lion condense 999 Tao principles? What kind of astonishing bloodline did it possess that had allowed it to grow up to such an extent? The golden lion unleashed its power. Its entire body started to appear like it had been adorned in a golden armor. An imposing aura of the king of 10,000 beasts emerged from his body, and spread across the void. Its 4 claws causally tore open a crack in the void. Yi Shiwen immediately understood from where Emperor Chen had gotten such confidence. It was because he and this golden lion had teamed up. The Twin Stars brothers considered being in a team as their biggest advantage. But, this advantage had become a big joke all of a sudden. Other people didn't know the origin of this golden lion. But, Yi Shiwen did. Most of the baby beasts that had come out of the eggs of those tyrannical ancient demon beasts had fled when they were back on the demon island. However, a few of these eggs had fallen into the hands of a handful of experts such as Emperor Chen, Qing Su, Ji Mingyu etc. Therefore, some of the experts had obtained these eggs of the demon beasts. The demon beasts that hatched out of these eggs possessed unbounded potentials. They also seemed to have extraordinary bloodline, just like the wolf cub. Yishuan had once asked the wolf cub about this. However, the wolf cub hadn't said anything on the subject. Chapter 445, Qin Wang vs. Emperor Qin, Part 3. The wolf cub had always avoided talking about the origins of these baby beasts as if it was some profound secret. He would never say anything, no matter how much Yishuan asked. The wolf cub's mouth was tightly sealed on this issue. Yishuan couldn't do anything about this matter. The wolf cub had always been carefree. However, he was always clear about what to say, and what not to say. Nobody could make him speak if he had decided not to say anything. However, Yishuan was certain that these baby beasts didn't have meager origins. Yishuan recalled the wolf cub as soon as he saw that golden lion. Several years had passed in a wink, and he no longer knew of the wolf cub's whereabouts. He didn't know whether the wolf cub had made the breakthrough into the sage realm or not. However, he could see that this golden lion that once used to be at the mere truth realm had reached the peak of the semi-sage realm by now. Therefore, the wolf cub wouldn't have lagged behind either. In fact, he might have progressed even faster. The invincible imposing aura of the golden lion swept out. Several disciples couldn't help but feel inferior as they looked at this golden lion. There was a difference of heaven and earth between them and that golden lion. The golden lion ferociously trod forward, and the void disintegrated into pieces under his footsteps. It looked towards the sky, and roared. The sonic boom perforated in all directions. Qin Wang couldn't sit still when faced with such a powerful golden lion. The origin of his own mount was outstanding as well. It was at the late stage of the semi-sage realm. However, it was still somewhat inferior to this golden lion. So, it couldn't help but draw back a step when confronted with the imposing aura of the golden lion. There's a disparity, someone exclaimed. Qin Wang's steed possesses the bloodline of some mythological animal. It's strong enough to crush the common elite. However, there's a clear disparity between it and this golden lion. It may not have fully matured yet. However, it looks a bit weak in comparison, an unsatisfied disciple added with indignation. Yishuan looked. The disciples of the true martial university were unsatisfied since Qin Wang was getting suppressed by Emperor Qin. The real fight is yet to begin. Yishuan calmly noted. In fact, several disciples had made the same judgment as Yishuan. They didn't possess high strength. However, their sharp gazes were still fixed on these two individuals. Neither of the two parties appeared exhausted at this time. This clearly meant that they had reserved their strength. What? They haven't displayed their entire strength? They look so frightening even though they haven't used their entire strength. That microcosm will get smashed into pieces if they went all out. I hope their attacks don't reach the public square. Someone spoke up in astonishment as they heard Yishuan's comment. No. They've displayed their entire strength on one occasion. Yishuan pondered. These experts looked conceited and confident from outside, but they couldn't dare to not use their full strength while facing each other. They wouldn't hold back like they had when they had dealt with ordinary opponents. This was a fight between the experts. Therefore, it would be the end of one if the opponent got even a moment's opportunity. Moreover, there wasn't that big of a disparity between Qin Wang and Emperor Qin. They differed, but only by a bit. Who among these two would dare to be careless if such was the case? That clash a moment ago was only a way to probe each other's strength. The real fight was yet to begin. I'm giving you a chance to go all out. I am told that you possess such strength that you had once wiped out an entire country. Emperor Qin shouted loudly as he remained seated upright on the golden lion, so, I am giving you just one chance. Reveal your true strength now. Or, you'll die today. Insolent. He was extremely insolent. It seemed as if he didn't pay attention to a peerless expert like Qin Wang. He would make Qin Wang reveal the entire extent of his strength. And then, he would defeat him. This would prove his tyranny. Behead a powerful enemy at his best, and prove one's skill. This was the common problem with nearly every powerhouse. They strongly believed that their own way would become even stronger and steadier after they had defeated the powerful enemies who followed a different path. You'll regret this. Qin Wang replied in a low and muffled voice. It seemed as if his voice was coming from a closed jar. But, his voice was ice cold. Nobody knew his current mood, they didn't know whether it was good or bad since his entire face was covered with a metal mask. The horse he was seated on looked up to the sky, and neighed. The sound of its whining shook the surroundings. A terrifying force swept out, and opened a crack in the void. It was an exceptional and mythological beast in its own merit. It would have become extremely dreadful if it had reached maturity. Qin Wang took out a scroll from his back. He threw it up in the sky. That very long scroll suddenly went upward, and unfolded. It then began to revolve around Qin Wang in a frantic manner, just like a giant dragon. Suddenly, the sound of horses' neigh sounded from inside the page of the scroll, and echoed everywhere. A group of cavalry riders appeared before everyone's eyes. They had burst out of the scroll with long spears in their hands. They were clad in iron armors. These are puppets. Yi Shiwen opened his eyes wide. They looked like humans. However, Yi Shiwen couldn't feel any trace of vitality from their bodies. In other words, these cavalry soldiers were devoid of life. However, they were different from the ghost soldiers that Yi Shiwen had seen in the past. And, they were unlike zombies. In fact, he wasn't getting that kind of gloomy and cold vibes from them. They were giving him an ice-cold feeling, just like the one an individual gets from a metal. He wasn't mistaken. They genuinely were puppets. Aren't these puppets? Many people asked in a doubtful manner. What is it about this that you don't understand? These are Qin Wang's mysterious guards. He had wiped out that small country with their help. Someone who knew about them explained, "You're not wrong. These are puppets." However, they become a dreadful army in the hands of Qin Wang. Nobody can resist the might of these mysterious armored guards. Each of these puppets possesses the strength of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Each of them has condensed more than 800 Tao principles. Each of them is extremely dreadful. Such force is sufficient to sweep away the invincible peers of the same generation. Someone was shocked to find that each of these puppets had terrifying strength. Each of these puppets had condensed at least 800 Tao principles. In fact, some had even condensed 990 Tao principles. This was a very frightening force. There had been a debate since ancient times, whether the power of one individual expert was more dreadful, or the power of an army. However, no final conclusions had been drawn regarding this debate. There had always been disputes between the arguments about quality and quantity. There had been incidents where an individual had destroyed an entire army. And, there had also been incidents where an army had slaughtered an incredible powerhouse. So, there was hardly any way to reconcile these two contradictions. However, these mysterious guards possessed both strength and quantity as far as the present scenario was concerned. There were over 1,000 mysterious guards. There were about 300 cavalry soldiers, 500 infantry soldiers, and 200 archers amongst them. This army was like a flock of sparrows. They were small in numbers. However, they were equipped with all sorts of troop divisions. This explains those widely spread rumors that he had wiped out an entire country once. However, it's not easy to manufacture these sophisticated puppets. It needs excellent skills. Even a sage expert can't handle the massive consumption of energy that's required in the process. And, how did he get so much financial resources? Someone asked. These puppets were extremely powerful. Each of them was at the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Such puppets were spread throughout the true martial world. However, they weren't present in large numbers because they were considered physically weak. Everything depended on the materials that had been used to make them, and their cultivation level. They would break easily if their quality wasn't good. However, a huge volume of resources would be required to manufacture super-quality puppets. An ordinary person, or even an ordinary force, couldn't afford to make such things. Moreover, it would only be fruitful if these puppets were manufactured in large quantities. A single puppet wouldn't give good result. The higher their numbers, the more dreadful they would be. However, the requirement of resources would also increase with the increase in quantity. Therefore, an ordinary person couldn't even dare to think of making them. Only some big forces possessed such huge amount of resources. You may not know this, but Qin Huang is the prince of the Tang Empire. The Tang Empire is one of the biggest empires of the southern region. Moreover, he holds the top position in the empire. So, it's not strange that he possesses these resources. Someone explained. He got the title of a Huang because of the authority he obtained when he went on expeditions to expand his empire's territory. Just how much resources would be required to make so many mysterious guards of the late stage of the semi-sage realm? Yi Xuan couldn't help but hold his breath. Qin Huang had come from a wealthy background. He came from a powerful clan, and had the backing of a great force. Yi Xuan realized that providing for a blood slave had been such a taxing job for him. So, what could one say about providing for 1,000 puppets? One simply couldn't afford it unless one had the backing of a huge force. Yi Xuan became somewhat envious in his heart. However, he was only envious of the guy, nothing more. After all, he preferred his free life over being part of some big force since there weren't any kind of restrictions on him. Qin Huang's dreadful army of puppets was frightening enough to scare off people since they had both quality and quantity. Even a notorious opponent like Yi Xuan might die if he came across them. This was going to be an amazing gang war. It was hard to predict how Emperor Chen would react. Yi Xuan looked at Emperor Chen. The man wore a callous smile on his face. He looked at the 1,000 mysterious guards as they advanced towards him. But, he didn't do anything to stop them. Is this all you've got? Then, the time of your death has arrived. Emperor Chen loudly roared. The energy dissipated in all directions, and engulfed everything. The entire world trembled in the wake of his roar. Countless mountains broke down into pieces by the shock of his voice. It was an exceptionally terrifying spectacle. Qin Huang remained calm and collected. However, those 200 archers in the crowd of his mysterious army guards prepared their bows. They effortlessly held the huge arrows in their hands. A person with good eyes could see that each of these arrows was a divine tool in a reality. A divine tool was said to be capable to breaking any principle. What can be considered as rich? Well, this could be. Who could dare to be extravagant enough to use divine tools as arrows without the backing and resources of such a huge empire like the Tang Empire? Whoosh! 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 200 long arrows cut through the sky. Each of these long arrows darted forward like a tornado. Those long arrows appeared like long dragons as they raided towards Emperor Chen. Bang! Emperor Chen immediately brandished his long spear. It unleashed terrifying rays of light. It swept down, and broke dozens of arrows at once. Those divine tools appeared like a bunch of rolled paper sticks in front of Emperor Chen's spear. Whoosh! 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 The rest of the long arrows struck Emperor Chen's body, and produced sparks after they crashed into his fiery red armor, and made clang sounds. Those long arrows severed the void around Emperor Chen. These voids had been opened rapidly, and were closing slowly. It was an unusually terrifying scene. Chapter 446, Chapter 446, Qin Huang vs. Emperor Chen, Part 4, each of these long arrows would have pierced the body of an ordinary expert of the late stage of semi-sage realm, and would have crucified them to the ground. In fact, the said individual wouldn't have been able to manage a narrow escape. Qin Huang had once defeated an entire army with the help of these archers. This isn't good enough. Is this all you've got? Emperor Chen burst into laughter and shouted in a cold voice. His spear swept those long arrows away, and deflected them. However, 300 cavalrymen with boundless imposing auras rushed towards him right after that rain of arrows stopped. His voice had barely faded away at this time. There were only 300 cavalrymen. However, it seemed as if they carried the combined imposing auras of 10 million soldiers. It shook the entire world, and the mountains were left to tremble. This kind of dreadful might could even break the world. Bang! Those 300 cavalrymen had arrived at Emperor Chen's side to kill him in a flash. It seemed as if those riders had integrated to form an amalgam as they concentrated at one place. It had seemed as if they had come on a peerless conquest as they arrived in front of Emperor Chen. These 300 elite riders displayed incomparable might as they dashed forward. They then seemingly combined into one entity. They condensed into a long spear, and then swept towards Emperor Chen to impale him. Emperor Chen sneered. He brandished his own long spear, and it collided severely with the incoming attack. Rumble! The entire space once again collapsed, and broke into pieces. It seemed as if there was no way the space could have withstood such a terrifying force. This microcosm wasn't strengthened like the space of the metropolis Marshall Peak. In fact, it was extremely easy for the experts of the semi-sage realm to smash the space of such a weak microcosm to pieces. Yi Shiwen's eyes opened wide in amazement. The team of these 300 elite riders had stopped the attack of an expert like Emperor Chen. It wasn't surprising that Qin Wang held the record of annihilating a small country. Such kind of strength was very rare. One always resorts to the thing that works the best for them in a battle. And, Qin Wang was at his best in group battles. Annihilating the capital of a country and massacring everyone in the captured cities would have been an ordinary thing for him if his mysterious armored guards had displayed their most terrifying strength while facing the army of a country. These guards were merely at the semi-sage realm. However, Qin Wang would possibly move a step ahead, and would form an elite army of sage experts once he had entered the sage realm. Such an army would be sufficient to sweep away everything. The sage realm and the semi-sage realm were two entirely different concepts. So, he would require a much higher amount of resources to create sage realm puppets in comparison to the amount required to create these semi-sage ones. However, it didn't matter if he couldn't create an entire army of sage realm puppets. It would be extremely terrifying even if he could create just 1/10 sage realm puppets of the total amount that he possessed at the moment. 100 sage realm experts would be enough to destroy any army. However, Qin Wang somewhat seemed at a disadvantage in this duel. Rumble! A terrifying energy wave came out from the tip of Emperor Chen's spear, and scattered in all directions. The energy wave swept across, and the puppets that came in front of it got destroyed in a flash. Bang! 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 Sounds of countless terrifying explosions reverberated. An endless energy storm was set off, and the rock granules were sent flying along with it. It seemed as if these explosions would crush everything. The long spear in Emperor Chen's hands moved as quickly as a dragon, and unleashed numerous spear shadows. Each of these spear shadows swept out in the sky at a lightning speed. They then formed a network of densely packed spears. Clang! 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 Each of these spear shadows killed one puppet. Emperor Chen, that's enough. Qin Wang's loud shout sounded from afar. He curled his fingers, and a long bow appeared in his grasp. It was almost the size of a person. He pulled the bowstring, and a huge energy arrow appeared. Whoosh! It went blazing towards Emperor Chen. An incomparably bright light illuminated the surroundings. It streaked through the vast sky, and formed a scary fissure in the picturesque sky. Waves after waves of chaos leaked out endlessly from the other side. Bang! That long arrow went straight for Emperor Chen, and arrived in front of him almost immediately. However, Emperor Chen looked calm and composed. He lifted his spear, and moved forward to welcome the attack. His spear opened its mouth wide like a dragon. It seemed as if it would engulf the long arrow. Bang! The long arrow clashed with Emperor Chen's spear. The tremendous force that resulted from this collision set off a huge storm. The long arrow had contained a dreadful power. Emperor Chen's spear trembled for the first time. His golden lion was also affected by the huge force and roared. Its face looked exceptionally fierce. However, it couldn't resist this terrifying force, and drew a step back. Sage tool, that's actually a sage tool. Yi Xuan immediately recognized the long bow that was in Qin Wang's hand. It was a sage tool. It possessed infinite power. But, Emperor Chen's spear wasn't a weak sage tool either. Yi Xuan had the Heavenly Source Mirror. Other Heaven's Pride experts also had different sage tools. Each of these Heaven's Pride expert was indeed more tyrannical than the other. One must know that many sage experts were still using pseudo-sage tools. However, these Heaven's Pride experts had started to use sage tools. These two individuals had displayed the ultimate might of their sage tools. In fact, they might even be able to face a sage expert if they would show such coordination with their sage tool. They might even face a sage expert at his full strength by burning the primary spirit dawn endlessly. This was the most terrifying thing about sage tools. These two individuals had displayed the power of their sage tools to a horrifying extent. It was much superior to the might displayed by Sun Zhanpeng's long blade. In fact, the extent of power unleashed by these two was far beyond Sun Zhanpeng's reach. Their coordination with their sage tools wasn't as profound as the one Yi Xuan had with the Heavenly Source Mirror. However, it was still very shocking. Initially, there wasn't a big disparity between these two individuals. And, both of them had taken out their sage tools at this moment. So, the disparity between them had shortened even further. One could even fight against a sage expert with a sage tool in one's hand. However, these two were merely top experts of the semi-sage realm. They might die if caught off guard. The one who would be careless would get killed by the other's sage tool, and may end up joining the souls of the deceased. Whoosh, the shrill sound of breaking of space sounded again. The terrifying rays of light emitted, and set off a huge tornado. A sharp arrow once again rushed towards Emperor Chen. The remaining 200 mysterious elite riders also dashed towards Emperor Chen to kill him. Meanwhile, the 200 archers had started to shoot waves of arrows. The 500 infantry soldiers who were initially present around Qin Wang had also launched a grandiose attack. Each of these soldiers was at the late stage of the semi-sage realm. The collaborated attack of these many soldiers was bound to be incredibly powerful and scary. How can this Qin Wang be so powerful? I've heard that he wiped out an entire country once. That was already enough to leave everyone in extreme shock. But, he's even suppressing a Heaven's Pride expert like Emperor Chen now? In fact, Emperor Chen doesn't seem to have the power to fight back. Qin Wang is too terrifying. Emperor Chen has outstanding reputation. He once killed 2 Heaven's Pride experts at the same time. It's not possible for anyone to suppress a person like him. This is like cheating, a disciple of East Sea's Muddy Sky Island shouted in displeasure. However, he had to face the criticism of many people in return. Only a weak person would say such words. Those puppets were a part of Qin Wang's strength. Anyone could have formed such an army if they had the skill to do so. Even Emperor Chen's mount, that golden lion, had also condensed 999 Tao principles. Wouldn't that be considered as taking unfair advantage? Why didn't they say that Emperor Chen was taking unfair advantage when Qin Wang hadn't displayed his entire strength? However, they had started to complain now. There wasn't anything right or wrong about it. Even luck could be considered as a part of one's strength. And why not? Emperor Chen has been suppressed and doesn't have the power to fight back. What a joke. He'll counterattack soon. Yi Xuan heard the assessments of those people and sneered. The real fight is going to start now. The long arrow arrived near Emperor Chen in front of thousands of staring eyes. He had been held up by those mysterious elite riders. They weren't worthy of being his opponents, but they were powerful enough to hold him up. The vicious currents produced by the approaching long arrow grazed Emperor Chen's cheeks. And his clothes made fluttering sounds. Whoosh! The golden lion emitted magnificent golden light, and disappeared from the spot, along with Emperor Chen. Rumble! Countless attacks landed at the spot where he had stood a moment ago. Qin Wang had bombarded that spot along with those thousands of mysterious armored guards. This attack was equivalent to the joint attacks by hundreds of top semi-sage experts. Bang! The space couldn't endure the devastation, and got shattered into small pieces. It was literally reduced to fine powder. It was an exceptionally frightening scene. However, there was no trace of the target. Yi Xuan noticed something. And Qin Wang obviously hadn't forgotten to pay attention to this either. He frantically scanned the entire place through his mask. Flash! A golden light flashed out of the blue the very next second. Emperor Chen's appeared in front of Qin Wang. He was seated on his golden lion. They were approximately 10 meters away from him. Such distance was far enough for an ordinary person. However, that kind of distance was nothing for an ordinary semi-sage expert. The big personalities seated atop the tall platform saw this scene from inside the clouds that lingered around the platform. They immediately stood up from their seats in shock. What exactly had they seen? They had seen instant transportation. That's right. It wasn't difficult for them to see it when one considers their high martial power. It wasn't that Emperor Chen's movement was too fast and his speed had caused an illusion in the eyes of the spectators. He had actually used instant transportation. This was the space manipulation ability. This had to leave everyone in extreme shock. One must know that there are many principles. But the most mysterious one was the principle of space, besides the time principle. Even the great sage experts couldn't feel and touch the principle of space. And, whoever had understood the principle of space, had become invincible among his peers. They could travel back and forth in space. This was an ordinary thing for them. And, it was nearly impossible to defeat such people. Only a few individuals were born with such talents. Only a few people could understand the principle of space among the billions of people present. And, it was possible that one might start using the principle of space at a lower realm. Even Yi Xuan was inexplicably shocked. He had also seen this clearly. It wasn't hidden from him. He had also seen that the space had fluctuated at that very moment when Emperor Chen had disappeared. This was the ability of space. It wasn't surprising that Emperor Chen had been so confident, and had looked down on everyone. Qin Wang responded almost immediately. He picked his bow, and twirled his fingers around it, as if it were a scissor. He made a series of movements in that very instant. He didn't stop, nor did he show any hesitation. However, Emperor Chen had already arrived very close to him. He wasn't even 10 feet away from him at this time. Whoosh! Chapter 447. Whoosh! Qin Wang released the long arrow from his hand. It made a raid towards Emperor Chen, just like a dragon. Flash! Emperor Chen once again transformed into a golden flash, and disappeared before everyone's eyes. Bang! The long arrow smashed on the ground, and opened a huge crack. Everyone looked more carefully this time. Yi Xuan again felt the fluctuations in the space. His heart sank. This was indeed spatial ability. This was the most troublesome and thorny matter. The principle of space was second only to the abstruse principle of time in terms of profoundness. Even the great sage experts had no way to feel the traces of this principle. They could feel its traces only if they were born with such talent. Otherwise, they could only use some shallow applications of space principles since it was difficult to use in actual combat. So, what could one say about disappearing and reappearing anywhere and any time like Emperor Chen could? This wasn't possible for average people. The great sage experts could rip open the void. However, they might get lost in the chaos if they went in. It would then be impossible for them to come out of it without having the coordinates. Coordinates. Suddenly, something clicked in Yi Xuan's mind. Flash! Emperor Chen had disappeared once again. He appeared behind Qin Wang this time. His long spear struck down to crush Qin Wang like a rolling mountain. Bang! Emperor Chen's attack caught Qin Wang off guard. Qin Wang didn't get enough time to react. He got knocked off from his horse, and fell down. He crashed into the ground, and his fall created a huge crater. Even the mysterious guards who were beside him didn't get the time to react. Emperor Chen once again disappeared, and then appeared right above Qin Wang's head the very next moment. He thrust his spear downward towards Qin Wang, as if to stab him to death. Whoosh! A long arrow was once again unleashed, and it went blazing out. It spread brilliant rays of light across the sky, and arrived right in front of Emperor Chen in a split second. However, Emperor Chen disappeared just when it was about to penetrate his body. Qin Wang once again got on top of his horse, and sat upright. But, he was shivering slightly. Emperor Chen had posed no small threat to his life a moment ago. Everyone was in uproar. They hadn't anticipated the situation to turn into this. Qin Wang had gained the upper hand in the fight a moment ago. However, he had suddenly been forced into a disadvantageous position by Emperor Chen. The two experts no longer seemed on the same level in terms of performance either. A clear disparity had become visible between the two great experts. The expert who possessed the ability of space had turned out to be more powerful one. This was beginning to reflect very vividly and very thoroughly at this moment. Bang! Emperor Chen suddenly appeared behind Qin Wang. His spear struck down upon Qin Wang, and struck him on his back. Qin Wang was sent flying once again. His armor got shattered, and his blood splattered. Yi Xuan had come to realize that Emperor Chen didn't possess the spatial ability. Rather, it was the golden lion he was seated on who had this ability. It must have been derived from the bloodline that it possessed. However, what difference would it make? Both of them could be considered as one. Qin Wang didn't stay at one place after he had received this blow, and started to move around at a lightning speed. He would attack at once whenever Emperor Chen appeared. However, he still couldn't restrain Emperor Chen. In fact, Emperor Chen would manage to inflict heavy damage on Qin Wang whenever he'd obtained the slightest opportunity. Some time passed in this manner. Qin Wang's blood splashed, and bone fragments swirled in the air. He no longer had the strength to fight back. The condition of the injuries on his body had become more serious. And, his movements had become even slower and sluggish. His entire body was covered with wounds. It was an extremely tragic scene. Emperor Chen's movements had become even quicker on the contrary. And, his attacks had become even fiercer and ruthless. A chill ran inside the spectators who were watching from the observatory microcosm. This was an extremely tragic fight. They had anticipated it to be an evenly matched fight. However, the outcome had turned out to be like this. There was no longer any suspense attached to this fight. It had seemed as if it would be an evenly matched battle. However, Qin Wang's entire body was drenched in blood at the moment. In fact, nearly half of his body had been blown off. However, Emperor Chen was fine. Bang! Qin Wang was once again blasted away. He went flying. His entire arm had been blown to smithereens. Everyone stood up from their seats. Emperor Chen didn't care about Qin Wang's screams, and thrust down his spear. It almost seemed like a dragon. Stop! Even the most calm and composed Supreme Lord of True Martial University couldn't help but shout as he realized that Qin Wang was about to get killed. There wouldn't have been any problem if an ordinary Heaven's Pride expert were to die. However, Qin Wang was different. He was a top elite among the Heaven's Pride experts. How could he be compared with an ordinary Heaven's Pride expert? The Supreme Lord's loud shout transformed into a dragon's roar, and entered the microcosm. The microcosm trembled under its effect. Emperor Chen heard this. However, he sneered disdainfully, and thrust his long spear down. Bang! Qin Wang's body got nailed to the ground along with his mouth. The breeze carried a trace of bloody smell along with it. Qin Wang was dead. Everyone was dumbstruck. They hadn't anticipated that this could be the outcome. Perhaps they had anticipated it. However, they hadn't thought that the fight would end like this. They had believed that perhaps none of these two individuals would win the fight. However, they hadn't expected it to evolve into an entirely one-sided battle. Good, very good. The Supreme Lord took his seat again. He sneered twice, and didn't say anything. He must have seen such a tragic scene, the death of his own disciples, and that of others several times in this competition since it was held every 100 years. He had seen so much that he had become too insensitive towards it by now. The Muddy Sky Island's Lord smiled mischievously, unlike the Supreme Lord. However, he didn't say anything. He seemed quite self-satisfied based on the look on his face. This fight had already ended, regardless of whether one was willing to accept this outcome or not. This fight had been the first face-off between the 8 Heavens Pride experts. And Emperor Qin could now be considered as the strongest among them. People had been scared out of their minds after they had watched such an outcome. Everyone had to acknowledge Emperor Qin's strength. Many people had already started to consider him the top expert among the entire range of Heaven's Pride experts. They felt that nobody could match him. Everyone had become quite pessimistic about other contenders after they had watched his spatial ability. How could anybody compete against such a person? Several people felt that Emperor Qin's strength had already surpassed everyone else's. The other fights couldn't attract the attention of most spectators after the fight between Emperor Qin and Qin Wang concluded. The third day's competition came to an end soon after. However, everyone had become even more excited. The fourth day's competition must be countless times more intense than the third day's. Only the experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm were left in the competition by now. They had gotten to watch the fight between only one pair of Heaven's Pride experts today. However, the fights tomorrow would take place between 3 pairs of Heaven's Pride level experts. The winner of yesterday's contest, Emperor Qin, would face the expert of his own school in the first group. His opponent would be none other than Sea Demon Jin Wushuang. The people of Muddy Sky Island had become restless after they watched such an arrangement of the competition. However, they didn't have any way to express their disagreement. The arrangement of fights was random at first. However, it had been fixed afterwards. Therefore, one could only advance after they had defeated their predetermined opponents. In other words, only one of these 2 famous Heaven's Pride experts of the Muddy Sky Island would be able to advance in this time's competition. The fight between these 2 experts of the same sect was one contest. And the second one would take place between Xian Yuan Palace Hall's twin stars and True Martial University's Han Bing Wang. Han Bing Wang was the most low-key and mysterious person among these 8 Heaven's Pride experts. It would be impossible to catch a glimpse of him if he weren't fighting in the competition. And he would again disappear after the competition. The bright moonlight in the sky had sprinkled upon the earth tonight. Yi Xuan lay atop a tall platform on top of the hidden star peak. He was staring at the countless stars that occupied the sky. He was lost in his thoughts. He had arrived at the hidden star peak after he had covered the entire ancient road. And he had done so one step at a time. Nearly 10 years had passed in a flash. Time had disappeared without leaving any trace, just like a white steed flits past a crack. Yi Xuan had always wanted to return to Earth. So, he was practicing as quickly as possible. He wanted to return to the Earth before his parents from previous life would pass away. However, he had come to realize that he had thought it to be a simpler task than it was in reality. 10 years had passed in an instant. He was still somewhat away from the sage realm. God knows when he would find the way back to the Earth. He undoubtedly longed to return to Earth. However, the hope to go and meet his real parents had gradually extinguished. It was needless to mention that he didn't even know where the Earth was located. In fact, he didn't even know whether the Earth was situation in the same dimension or not. Brother Yi. The shadow of a tall person appeared before Yi Xuan's eyes at this time. Brother Bai. Yi Shiwen sat up from the resting position. Weren't you undergoing closed-door training? Bai Jian-song had already made the breakthrough into the Great Sage realm. However, he had obtained great insights during that fight earlier. Moreover, he wanted to consolidate his newly obtained Great Sage cultivation. Therefore, he had been undergoing closed-door training. Haha. Sometimes you have to come out to take a breath of fresh air. Bai Jian-song laughed and said, Congrats Brother Yi, you have advanced so far in the competition. Why are you congratulating me? I haven't won the championship yet. Yi Shiwen was blunt about it. He and Bai Jian-song had become quite familiar with each other. Yi Shiwen wouldn't have spoken such frank words otherwise. Bai Jian-song just looked at Yi Shiwen. He didn't mind his words. He sat down beside him, and replied, There's obviously a reason. Haha, it seems as if Qin Wang's death has affected some old fogies rather strongly. Some people have flown into a rage out of humiliation. The old fogies of Jade Yang Peak are even angrier than the others. Jade Yang Peak was Qin Wang's inheritance. It was also one among the top 10 inheritances. Jade Yang Peak had nurtured Qin Wang as their future hope and pillar of support. They had allowed him to participate in this time's competition so that he could gain some experience. Nobody could match Qin Wang among his peers as per his strength in their opinion. It should have been impossible for anyone to force him to retreat. Who would have thought that Emperor Chen would crucify him on the ground in front of thousands of spectators? Some old fogey told me that they want you to look for an opportunity to get rid of Emperor Chen. You will get a reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn as long as you kill Emperor Chen. This would obviously be separate from the assigned competition's reward. Chapter 448. Jade Yang Peak was Qin Wang's inheritance. It was also one among the top 10 inheritances. Jade Yang Peak had nurtured Qin Wang as their future hope and pillar of support. They had allowed him to participate in this time's competition so that he could gain some experience. Nobody could match Qin Wang among his peers as per his strength in their opinion. It should have been impossible for anyone to force him to retreat. Who would have thought that Emperor Chen would crucify him on the ground in front of thousands of spectators? Some old fogey told me that they want you to look for an opportunity to get rid of Emperor Chen. You will get a reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn as long as you kill Emperor Chen. This would obviously be separate from the assigned competition's reward. Bai Jian-song looked at Yi Shiwen with his shining eyes as the corners of his mouth stretched into a smile. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but hold his breath as he heard 10 million primary spirit dawn. The Jade Yang Peak hadn't merely flown into a rage out of humiliation. They had also gone insane in anger. 10 million primary spirit dawn. Obtain that, plus the primary spirit dawn from the rewards of the competition would be enough for him to make the breakthrough into the Sage realm. Moreover, he wouldn't have to be worried about the insufficiency of primary spirit dawn in the process of his breakthrough. Yi Shiwen had obviously become anxious. He was also determined to kill Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen was extremely dangerous for him. Moreover, Emperor Chen had never concealed his hostility and killing intention for him. So, it would be better to root out this source of trouble. However, it could be said that Yi Shiwen didn't really adhere to the pedantic mindset of, the best enemy is a deceased enemy, like most people did. He was planning to kill Emperor Chen anyway. And now, the Jade Yang Peak had offered him 10 million primary spirit dawn for the same. This was a golden opportunity. Let me tell you, this isn't the highest price they can offer. There's still a margin for negotiation. I can talk to them if you want. Bai Jian-song added. You don't need to. 10 million primary spirit dawn will do. Yi Shiwen replied since he wasn't a greedy and insatiable person. The smile came back to Bai Jian-song's serious face when he saw that Yi Shiwen was the kind of person who knew when to stop. People are often unclear about when they should demand more, and when they shouldn't. However, you must be careful. I've heard that Emperor Chen possesses the spatial ability. This is an extremely dreadful ability. Bai Jian-song's complexion had turned serious again. Even he had been rendered dumbstruck when he had heard about this. The spatial ability was even rarer than those special physiques. Those special physiques were often traceable. In fact, most special physiques could be traced back to the powerful ancestors. For example, the Titan body was ferocious because his ancestors possessed the blood of Titans. Therefore, his ability could only be considered a result of an ancestral throwback. However, the spatial ability was different. It didn't leave any footprints. Moreover, it didn't appear in certain clans or at certain places. Any person could be born with such talent. However, only a very few such individuals had been discovered so far. Moreover, there were many such lucky people who had remained in the dark about this ability throughout their lives. They themselves didn't know that their body possessed spatial ability. Such people didn't show up often. However, they would turn out to be world-shaking whenever they did. I know. Yi Xuan nodded and said, but I've discovered that he doesn't possess the spatial ability. Rather, his mount that golden lion possesses this ability. There's no difference even if it is so. Aren't they one instead of two? Bai Jian-song replied. Yi Xuan wasn't the only one who had noticed this. Bai Jian-song had also felt this. However, it didn't matter whether Emperor Chen possessed this ability or that golden lion. After all, what difference would it make? They were one. That's why he didn't mention the golden lion separately, even if it possessed extremely tyrannical strength like Emperor Chen, and could alone deal with two ordinary Heaven's Pride experts without any problem. One would be gravely mistaken if one felt that the golden lion possessed the spatial ability, and Emperor Chen was nothing. After all, wasn't it Emperor Chen who had subdued that golden lion with the spatial ability? This could be inferred easily. However, he must die because of this. Yi Xuan was wary of him, and considered him as someone that required his attention. This young fellow can't be allowed to go on. Even the high-level experts of our university are as alarmed as the old fogies of the Jade-Yang Peak. Our true martial university's well-being may have to depend on his mood in the future if we allow him to mature. Bai Jian-song firmly said. These forces used to conduct such competitions because they themselves wanted to get rid of the Heaven's Pride experts of the enemy forces. These Heaven's Pride level experts didn't pose any threat to them at present. But, these forces were already thinking about the future. They clearly knew that these Heaven's Pride experts would become the backbones of their respective forces in the future. Of course, those old guys want you to retreat if you can't get rid of Emperor Chen. The university has already lost Qin Wang. So, they will lose everything if they lose you as well. Bai Jian-song added, I also want the same. It won't make any difference if you suffer a temporary defeat at this time. Your road is quite long. There's nothing to be afraid of, even if you lose 10,000 times. You just need to succeed once, and deliver him a fatal blow later on. And, that would be enough. Are you saying this because you aren't optimistic about me? Yi Xuan asked somewhat helplessly. However, Bai Jian-song hadn't spoken these words because he wasn't optimistic about Yi Xuan. He just didn't want to exert too much pressure on him. He felt that it would be better if Yi Xuan would pull back instead of falling into Emperor Chen's hands. Try to understand. The opposite party has spatial ability. Bai Jian-song didn't deny this fact. Such ability can turn out to be very troublesome. Especially in the early phase, when only they have the spatial ability, and no one else. They have the advantage, and this makes them dreadful. However, some of us will also learn to feel the traces of the space principle later on, and might even devise some method to counter this spatial ability. So, the disparity will decrease very significantly when that time comes. The human body was considered a universe on this road of martial arts, a universe that could be tempered. The so-called theory of having a universe inside one's body genuinely existed. In fact, Yi Xuan's observing person scripture had been created because of this theory. However, what was the so-called universe? The space and time had been interwoven together to form the universe. This was the innate character of the universe. Space was one of the two biggest constituents of universe. One could gradually start to feel the traces of the principle of space if they reached far enough while practicing on this road of martial arts. And, one would be able to comprehend the principle of space to some extent if they were successful. In fact, some people could also devise different methods for counterattacking this principle. The opposite party might have come up with more methods by that time. However, this invisible gap would still reduce rather significantly. Of course, this was true only for a portion of people who'd succeed in developing a deeper understanding of the principle of space. The disparity would only get bigger and bigger for a majority of people. Therefore, Bai Jian-song believed that it would be best if Yi Shuwen would retreat at this time. However, he didn't even think of suggesting Yi Shuwen to admit defeat. That was obviously impossible. The most important thing regarding these Heaven's Pride experts was that they possessed an invincible heart. They weren't like Shui Yen Luo and the others. A permanent flaw would emerge in the martial way of a Heaven's Pride experts if they were to admit defeat even once. And, their lifetime's accomplishments would be limited after this came to happen. Qin Wang had died, but he hadn't begged for mercy because of this reason alone. Anyway, even I'm not very much optimistic at this time. Yi Shuwen replied somewhat helplessly. He could also understand Bai Jian-song's thought process. Many people had already considered Emperor Chen as the winner of this competition after he had displayed the spatial ability. Who else could become the champion if not Emperor Chen? The man possessed the spatial ability. Emperor Chen wasn't popular as someone who'd win the competition in the beginning. Rather, Xian Yuan twin stars were. He was at the second place. However, he had suddenly surpassed the twin stars brothers, and had become everyone's favorite for winning the competition. This had been an astonishing paradigm shift. However, it had only taken place after Emperor Chen had revealed the spatial ability. Not being optimistic about you is one reason. However, I would also say that it would be better if you don't kill Emperor Chen, even if you have the ability to do so. Bai Jian-song added. Why? Yi Shuwen asked. Emperor Chen was a threat in his opinion. And, he would become even more dreadful in the future if he was allowed to mature. So, Yi Shuwen couldn't afford to let him off since he had an opportunity. He must seize the opportunity firmly, and give Emperor Chen a fatal blow. You don't understand. You guys have caught the attention of those old guys. Everyone has their gaze fixed on you guys. These people aren't limited to your own force alone. People from the other forces are also present. You must know that all of you are Heaven's Pride experts. Your future accomplishments are going to be limitless. And, that's why they care about you even more. Emperor Chen has already become an eyesore for many people. Our true martial university will be watching him closely from now on. And, I think even the other forces don't wish to let him off. The Fire Cloud Cave, the Xian Yuan Palace Hall, and even the other forces which currently have no conflict with him must be thinking in this manner. And, all of them are regarding him as an eyesore. In fact, the forces that are located in the East Sea would definitely take action against him once the competition ends. Our true martial university may have to live under his shadow in the future if a guy like him were allowed to develop. Similarly, many other people must be feeling a fatal threat from him. Therefore, it's possible that many operations would be directed against him in the near future. Bai Jian-song explained. Emperor Chen is already considered as an eyesore by most people. And, you will immediately take his place if you killed him. Then, you'd become an eyesore. You will become the focus of all those assassination operations in that scenario, and all sorts of obstacles will start to emerge in your path. And, that will basically be the most dangerous time for you. Bai Jian-song explained as he continued. Chapter 449. Yi Shuwen didn't say anything. He knew that the champion of this competition would become the target of every big force, and they would quickly try to dispose of him after the competition. In fact, the big forces which had participated in this competition wouldn't be the only ones. The several other forces which had arrived here as spectators would also go after the winner. And, this hadn't occurred only once or twice in the past. One would collapse if they couldn't carry this burden. However, one would soar to great heights if they managed to resist these forces. This was an opportunity to strengthen oneself. However, it could also turn into a dead end. Emperor Chen had become an eyesore for everyone the moment he displayed his spatial ability. Everyone believed that Emperor Chen had become a person whom nobody could shake from his position. The high-level experts believed this in particular. However, Yi Shiwen would immediately replace Emperor Chen from his unshakable position if he displayed enough strength to kill him. Consequently, he would become an eyesore for everyone. Let them come if they wish to use some dirty tricks. How will you see the rainbow unless you go through the storm? Yi Shiwen suddenly spoke up, none of their attacks can kill me. It will only make me stronger. A trace of madness flashed in Yi Shiwen's eyes. He wanted to exploit these threats to sharpen his skills and get stronger. He knew that there might be a difference of heaven and earth between him and that ancient phoenix world. He was like an ant on the ground that desired to look up at the divine world in the sky. He must grow stronger. And, he must grow up quickly so that he could challenge the sky. How could he say that he would bring Hua Menghan back from the ancient phoenix world if he didn't have the means to withstand these things? Ha ha ha. Good. Interesting. Bai Jian-song clapped his hands as he burst into laughter. He then said, Big Brother had also said the same thing in the past. You two are very similar. Those who wanted to get stronger and stronger until they ultimately became the strongest in the world, would have to make this choice. Yi Shiwen wasn't strange if one considered this aspect. One couldn't become the strongest without tempering themselves on the road to invincibility. I won't think twice if I get the opportunity to kill Emperor Chen. And, I'm sure that he won't hesitate to kill me either. Yi Shiwen said. He then told Bai Jian-song about the grudges between him and Emperor Chen. He must die, no matter whether it's for that previous resentment from Demon Island, or for this championship. Yi Shiwen looked serious as he spoke. He didn't say anything else apart from this. He would die if Emperor Chen didn't. One couldn't surrender in these fights. The only way to get out of such a fight was to either win, or die. Let's not talk about Emperor Chen at this time. You'll have to fight Qi Tian tomorrow. He's not a good guy to mess with either. Bai Jian-song said, individuals who possess the barbarian god's real body have appeared in every generation of the southern barbarians. And, each of them has become illustrious among the disciples of their generation. The barbarian god's real body could be considered as God's special physique. However, it was a man-made technique in reality, and could be controlled by humans. One or two individuals with barbarian god's real body had appeared in almost every generation. In fact, several people with this special physique had appeared on occasions. Moreover, people with barbarian gods' real bodies had appeared in the 100 Barbarian Cave, the Fire Cloud Cave, and other such forces. A fight would break out between these individuals in the event of the situation when several people with the barbarian god's real body appeared. And then, a winner would be decided. This winner would then be considered as the strongest person in that generation. People were mostly surprised by the fact that it seemed as if different barbarian gods' real bodies attracted each other. In fact, one could absorb the essence and blood of their enemies with the help of a secret technique as long as both the fighters possessed the barbarian god's real body after they had killed their enemy. This would make one's blood even thicker and stronger. This would effectively help one become stronger. A southern barbarian person who possessed the barbarian god's real body had appeared once upon a time. He had then killed 10 people who similarly possessed the barbarian god's real bodies. He was finally recognized as the top expert of that generation. And, he had emerged as an invincible southern barbarian expert in the future. He had also become one of the top experts in the true martial world at that time. He had even compelled the true martial university to mobilize search parties against him. However, he had suddenly disappeared after many years. The entire true martial world had shaken at that time. This was also the first time when the barbarian god's real body had become famous as one of the strongest physiques. Such a strong bloodline had made the successors of every successive generation exceptionally dreadful. Such an opponent couldn't be called weak from any aspect. I will beat him, no matter what. We can't even talk about dealing with Emperor Chen if I can't beat this guy. Yi Shiwen smiled and replied. His bright smile glittered under the moonlight. Cold wind continued to blow. The night passed away. The highly anticipated fourth day had finally arrived. The fight between three pairs of Heaven's Pride experts was going to take place on this day. Many people were contemplating the fight they should choose to see. Which fight would be exceptional? Each of those fights would be stunning in their own merit. So, it would be an extremely unfortunate thing to miss any of these fights. However, the reality had forced them to choose only one fight. So, they chose to watch the fight between Qi Tian and Yi Shiwen. And, the moment they had been excitedly waiting for was about to come. The day had finally arrived. The barbarian god's real body was the most tyrannical southern barbarian physique. And, Yi Shiwen had killed the one with the titan body in the past. So, he certainly had the most tyrannical physique in the younger generation of the southern region. The clash between the tyrant body and the barbarian god's real body was about to begin. And, everyone was looking forward to this fight. One individual possessed the strongest physique of the southern barbarians. In fact, this was the supreme physique of the barbarian god himself. He had left behind too many secrets. In fact, it was said that one could restore the barbarian god's lost prestige if one would cultivate it to the pinnacle. The opposing individual had once defeated the titan body, and had practiced an incredible power technique created by some ancient powerhouse. These two men are extremely tyrannical. This is a collision between the two strongest physiques of the southern region. The sun was shining in the sky. Qi Tian, the owner of the barbarian god's real body, had arrived in the microcosm. He was seated atop an unknown barbarian beast. He held a scarlet lance. Its tip virtually touched the ground. The vicious barbarian aura was sweeping out from his body. It seemed as if the barbarian god himself had reincarnated in the current age. The spectators weren't in the same microcosm, but they could still feel the dreadful fighting strength of the barbarian god's real body. His violent aura had scared everyone, and people had been left to tremble. Qi Tian is the only Heaven's Pride expert to represent the southern barbarians in this competition. However, he possesses the most tyrannical strength. He's also one of the people's favorites to win this competition. His popularity is only behind that of Emperor Chen and the Xian Yuan twin stars. It's difficult to say whether he can rival the strength of Emperor Chen since that man possesses the spatial ability. However, he's not one bit inferior to the Xian Yuan twin stars. A true Martial University disciple made an evaluation. Qi Tian quietly waited as he remained seated atop his mount, the strange barbarian beast. But, his exceptional, killing intention, was gradually sweeping out. This was like watching the scene of a peerless god of war tame the wilderness. He was quietly waiting for Yi Shiwen to arrive. Everyone held their breath, as if their breathing would destroy the aesthetic of this particular scene. The space distorted, and a figure arrived. It was an ordinary-looking youth. He arrived in the middle of the arena with small steps. He was Yi Shiwen. Qi Tian's imposing aura had covered the sky. But, Yi Shiwen's aura looked too ordinary in comparison. He was clad in ordinary cyan-colored clothes. Even his aura didn't seem to be strong. Ha 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 ha. You've arrived finally. I and many others have been waiting for this day for a long time now. Qi Tian burst into laughter as soon as he saw Yi Shiwen. He looked wild and vicious. He was brimming with arrogance. He had gotten excited after he had seen Yi Shiwen emergence. I've heard that you killed the Titan body. I obviously wanted to kill him too. However, you killed him first. So, it will be same if I kill you. Qi Tian's eyes turned red as he looked at Yi Shiwen. The endlessly boiling, killing intention was hardly concealed in his eyes. Qi Tian was like a typical barbarian. He considered everyone beneath him. In fact, he was just like Emperor Chen. Perhaps, his attitude wouldn't have changed even if Emperor Chen was standing in front of him right now. He possessed a strange type of incredible self-confidence. And, he had obtained countless victories because of this self-confidence. Kill me? Who do you think you are? Yi Shiwen sneered. Bang! Yi Shiwen's boundless imposing aura suddenly exploded. It set off a pillar of golden energy into the sky, and broke past the clouds. The golden divinities gradually crawled over him, and covered his entire body. It seemed as if he was clad in a golden divine robe. Inexhaustible golden divinities condensed under his feet, and formed a golden ocean beneath him. The golden rays of light illuminated half the sky. He suddenly started to seem like the god of the golden country. Yi Shiwen had transformed with an explosion, just like a god. Yi Shiwen had gone all out from the get-go. He hadn't underestimated his opponent. Two powerful auras collided in the middle. And, neither of the two auras was ready to give way to the other. The space was violently distorted by the collision of these two auras. These two men are extremely dreadful. What kind of power technique has this Yi Shiwen practiced that has made him so dreadful? He looks like a god, damn it, a courageous young disciple spoke up. Both of them look like gods. It's like the barbarian god and the golden god are going to fight in the sky. Everyone's even more hyped now. The tall platform was still hidden among the clouds and mist. The supreme leaders of the four major forces were quietly watching this fight between the Heaven's Pride experts. Two Heaven's Pride experts had been allowed to fight together as a team. The so-called Emperor Chen didn't seem affected by this fact. In fact, he had demonstrated the spatial ability, and was being considered to be the book champion. However, the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord was very confident about the Twin Stars brothers. He hadn't become worried even after Emperor Chen had displayed his spatial ability. After all, his two Heaven's Pride experts would get to fight as a team. They might not be a match for Emperor Chen in their individual accord. However, there wouldn't be any issue if they were to fight together as one. Ha 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 ha. All three Heaven's Pride experts of your true martial universities will be annihilated this time. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord burst into laughter as he looked at the supreme lord of the true martial university. Qin Wang had already been impaled to the ground. And, Han Bing Wang didn't stand any chance against the Xian Yuan twin stars as far as he was concerned. Nobody knows till the end. The Supreme Lord replied indifferently. He was neither sad, nor happy. He had seen such battles several times in every 100 years. So, these fights between junior experts couldn't move him on an emotional level. And, this was despite the fact that he also used to be a young expert once. Don't tell me that you still believe that your disciples can make a comeback. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord sneered and said, your Han Bing Wang is going to be toast. And, that Yi Shiwen has only practiced an incomplete power technique. It would have been fine if he had the complete version of that power technique. But, it's not a joke to mend a power technique on one's own. How can people of our rank not know how dreadful these ancient power techniques can be? Chapter 450, suppresses Qi Tian. The incredible power techniques of the ancient times held a special position in the eyes of these people. An ordinary person couldn't comprehend and practice these ancient power techniques to their fullest extent. Therefore, the very idea of being able to mend one such ancient power technique was out of question. Even they themselves had failed to do so. After all, how could one trace such fine lines without any guidance? As far as they were concerned, Yi Shiwen had merely patched his power technique, that's all. He wasn't strong. He merely appeared ferocious on the outside, like a paper tiger. The Supreme Lord didn't say anything. However, his face exposed a slight trace of a disdainful look. The death of Titan body would have been pure injustice if Yishuan's strength was superficial like a paper tiger's. In fact, it would have been the biggest injustice ever. Whether he's strong or a paper tiger, we won't be able to know that unless we have examined him properly. Fire Cloud Cave's lord sneered and said. Chi Tian's mount, that barbarian beast, was a mysterious creature, and nobody knew what it was. It looked exceptionally terrifying. It was exuding the aura of the Beast King. It made people tremble with fear. It was releasing cold energy that was surging up to the ninth heaven. You're quite wild. However, the wildness of a dead person is pretty useless. Chi Tian coldly looked at Yishuan and shouted, Die. The sonic boom dissipated in all directions. He urged the barbarian beast, and it forged ahead. An extremely terrifying energy dissipated in all directions. It seemed as if a barbarian horseman was sweeping across the southern region. He looked enormous and majestic as he rode that beast. In fact, he seemed like a reincarnation of the barbarian god himself. Clang! Yishuan also attacked with all his strength. A long sword condensed in his hand. He poured energy to lengthen the tip of the sword, and advanced towards Chi Tian. The void got cut apart wherever the long sword went. And, the chaotic energy leaked out. Bang! Both sides ferociously collided. The long sword and the lance knocked against each other. It seemed as if the world would break down into pieces, and the universe would turn upside down. A strange scene appeared in front of everyone. Chi Tian's nearly 10 feet tall figure suddenly collided with Yishuan's slim figure. Logically, Yishuan should have been sent flying off by the collision. However, the clash of these two men seemed similar to the clash of two giant stars. It was a very chaotic scene. It seemed as if the sky and the earth had turned upside down. Chi Tian was surprised to realize that he couldn't suppress Yishuan with pure strength. He had come across such a situation for the first time since he had mastered the barbarian god's real body. These two are equally matched. Yishuan can actually be placed on par with Chi Tian. Someone exclaimed. Nobody knew about Yishuan's tyrant body. However, Chi Tian's barbarian god's real body had been famous for countless years. Therefore, everyone was obviously more optimistic about Chi Tian. A ranking list of disciples had been made before the tournament had started. That list had placed Chi Tian at the 3rd rank. However, Yishuan had been placed at the 5th position, even lower than Qin Wang. You're strong enough. So, I can use you like a whetstone to sharpen my skills. Chi Tian grinned. He looked somewhat sinister. He'd actually dared to treat Yishuan as a whetstone. The hearts of several spectators present inside the microcosm shook ferociously. Chi Tian was extremely arrogant. He had dared to consider an opponent of the same level as a whetstone. However, many people also felt that Chi Tian was a very bold and skillful person. They felt that he wouldn't have dared to say such words if he wasn't courageous. Yishuan's eyes had turned ice cold. Chi Tian was indeed very strong. He was a well-known figure among the Heaven's Pride experts. He was powerful enough to be ranked as a top expert among his peers. So, Yishuan was extremely glad that this man had considered him as a whetstone for honing skills. Yishuan's golden divinities began to seethe upon his golden body. His golden divine clothes seemed as if they had begun to boil. The golden divine waves under his feet set off a huge tidal wave. Yishuan raised the tip of his long sword, and coldly looked at Chi Tian. Bang! Chi Tian moved. His mount looked towards the sky, and roared loudly. Its 4 hooves touched the ground, and the space began to tremble. It seemed as if the sky would collapse and fall onto the earth. He rushed forward. His lance was pointed at Yishuan. Chi Tian arrived in front of Yishuan within the blink of an eye. He swept out his lance. The weapon was even longer than Yishuan's height. It seemed as if it would stab Yishuan to death the very next second. However, Yishuan finally moved at this time, and brandished his long sword. Clang, a huge explosive sound of the collision of iron and gold metals sounded. The tip of the sword collided with the point of the lance. These two men looked like two formidable gods fighting on the earth. Both of them retreated several steps under the impact of the terrifying force. The space under their feet broke into pieces as they retreated. And a loud rumbling sound echoed. Their murderous auras overflowed the sky. Their attack power had dropped significantly from the time they had begun their fight. However, their movements were still astonishingly fast. They would use hundreds of moves against each other within a split second. The speed of their movements was comparable to that of lightning piercing the atmosphere. The complementary waves of their fight had bulldozed countless mountains. Their battle had been nothing short of an enormous disaster for this microcosm. In fact, the entire microcosm would soon get smashed into pieces if they weren't careful. Everyone was scared, especially the experts of the younger generation. They found themselves merely mediocre after having watched a fight of this level. Such fighting strength was enough to place them right under the sage realm. However, the younger spectators had merely cultivated for a few years. They were nothing in front of these two experts. Clang! The ferocious fight between these two men suddenly came to a halt. The lance was trembling in Qi Tian's hand. A terrified look flashed in his eyes. He had fought many people. However, he had become invincible ever since he had practiced the barbarian god's real body. So, most people didn't dare to fight with him. And, he had killed his opponents in one move even if anyone had dared to challenge him. However, nobody had dared to fight with him the way Yi Shiwen had. He suddenly recalled that the Titan body had died at the hands of Yi Shiwen. He hadn't believed this rumor at first. However, he was finally somewhat convinced that Yi Shiwen could have well killed the Titan body. After all, so many people wouldn't maliciously spread such kind of news if it were false. Damn that rumor! Qi Tian cursed. He had never doubted Yi Shiwen's fighting strength. However, he hadn't believed that Yi Shiwen would possess enough fighting strength to contend against him. After all, most physiques were inborn. And, perhaps many other special physiques had been created with the help of systematic methods like Qi Tian's. However, Yi Shiwen's physique wasn't innate. He had cultivated it on his own since he used to be a Ho Tian expert. Moreover, it used to be an incomplete power technique back then. It was a high-ranked technique that had been created by an ancient powerhouse, but a massive amount of energy must be required to cultivate such physique. He would obviously know this fact because his own physique was acquired, not innate. But, how did Yi Shiwen cultivate his physique on his own? What was more terrifying was the fact that he found himself getting suppressed by Yi Shiwen to some extent. Clang! The sound of metallic vibrations spread in the sky. The energy soared to the clouds. Yi Shiwen didn't give Qi Tian any chance to respite, and his long sword immediately swept down towards Qi Tian to crush him. These two men had started to resort to extreme methods. They had basically gone all out. It seemed as if each one of their attacks was aimed to kill. There was nothing fancy about these attacks. The long sword in Yi Shiwen's hand wasn't brandishing extraordinary sword moves. It was only unleashing basic sword moves. However, Yi Shiwen's hands possessed incredible might, and it seemed as this might was enough to destroy the heaven and extinguish the earth. He then went towards Qi Tian with such incredible power in an attack. Clang! Qi Tian had no choice but to move forward to face the attack. He couldn't afford to show any weakness at this time. He was guessing that Yi Shiwen would soon get exhausted, and wouldn't be able to continue thereafter. But, he wasn't up for this kind of a fierce struggle at the risk of one's life. So, he would by no means believe that Yi Shiwen was actually feeling more at ease. Bang! 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 Both sides went all out. They didn't use any fancy and gorgeous attacks. It was a collision of sheer powers. No fancy means would last in front of such brute power. Yi Shiwen and Qi Tian were habitual of suppressing their opponents. They would allow their opponents to use 1,000 techniques. However, they would use only one move to crush the opponent. It didn't matter whether their opponent could take their move or not. In fact, an opponent would still fall into their routine if the said individual was able to take their move. However, the opponent would get killed if they couldn't take that one strike. There was no other way. Bang! The two collided once again. Their figures interlocked in midair, and blood splashed out. Everyone stared with eyes wide opened. Who had gotten injured? Everyone was secretly guessing. Who had gotten injured? Chi Tian appeared rather tall when he was seated on his barbarian beast. And, the beast was even bigger than him. In fact, they looked like a small mountain. Yi Xuan was slim in contrast. However, he had given a tough fight to Chi Tian. And, his body was also extremely tyrannical. Both these men possessed iron-like bodies. So, who among these two had gotten injured? The movements of these two men had been lightning fast. Most people hadn't been able to track their movements as a result. They had only seen the blood splashing out. So, it was hard to tell who had gotten injured. The two men broke the interlock and staggered away from each other. The wind blew, and carried a faint smell of blood with it. The tall body of Chi Tian was still seated atop that barbarian beast. But, it was shaking, and blood was gushing out of his body. Yi Xuan had opened a huge wound in his chest. In fact, that wound was so deep that even his bones were clearly visible through it. Countless people had opened their eyes wide to see this scene. They didn't even blink. Everyone had been more optimistic about Chi Tian before the fight had started. But, they didn't know much about Yi Xuan's situation. Chi Tian's barbarian god's real body had become famous countless years ago. This had left them to have more confidence in Chi Tian. So, Chi Tian's victory would be a normal scenario in their eyes. In fact, several people had bestowed blind trust in Chi Tian. They had felt that he'd kill Yi Xuan with a bang. However, the first person to get injured wasn't Yi Xuan. It had turned out to be Chi Tian. This had left everyone extremely amazed. Chi Tian has sustained injury. How's this possible? Countless people exclaimed with doubts in their hearts. The disciples of the fire cloud cave especially couldn't believe their eyes as they saw this scene unfold. They had been very confident in Chi Tian's abilities. These disciples of the fire cloud cave had seen his might before. He was considered as a top-notch expert in the younger generation of the fire cloud cave. In fact, he had subdued the other Heaven's Pride experts in his sect to earn the big opportunity of participating in this competition. Chi Tian was the only major contestant to participate in this competition from the Fire Cloud Cave side. The first reason behind this was the heavy losses that the Fire Cloud Cave had suffered after they had come under the joint attack of the 100 Barbarians Cave and Devil Worship Cult. And, the second reason was because he had suppressed the other Heaven's Pride experts. This was also the usual practice for the southern barbarians. Only the most outstanding disciples could have the barbarian god's real body among the many disciples. And, only the most talented one among them would be trained to cultivate it to the fullest. Chi Tian had participated in this competition to win the championship. He didn't know that he would bump into Emperor Chen and Xian Yuan twin stars here, and would end up being ranked third favorite. And now, he had become the first one to get wounded in his fight against Yi Xuan. My God, how could there be so many evil geniuses? Chapter 451. Many disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave were in despair. They hadn't anticipated that such a scene would unfold. They had high hopes for Chi Tian. However, he was the first one to get injured. He was indeed wounded first, but that didn't mean that he had lost. He was representing them. So, they were obviously looking forward to watching him defeat Yi Xuan without breaking a sweat. However, their wish had become a delusion. This wouldn't have happened if Chi Tian had fully and effortlessly defeated Yi Xuan. This generation of experts was full of dazzling stars. Nobody knew who was the strongest. It could only be determined after collisions and battles. And the last one standing would be named the strongest. Qi Tian was also somewhat shocked. He was the one to get wounded first. However, the fierce expression returned on his face within a moment's time. His frightening eyes radiated ominous light. He was like a wild beast. The wound on his body recovered, and that too at such a speed that one could see it happening with naked eyes. His healing technique wasn't as fast as Yi Shiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique. However, the restoration capability of barbarian god's real body was indeed amazing. Yi Shiwen's gilded tyrant form hadn't reached the great completion level yet. It was still in a fumbling phase. He would transform when his tyrant body would reach great completion level. This physique could be only considered as a tough physique at the most. However, he hadn't witnessed a qualitative change in his physique yet. In Yi Shiwen's case, it could be assumed that the attainment of the so-called special physique would come in the form of genetic mutation. The genes in his body would transform when his tyrant body would reach the great completion level. And then, it could even be passed on to the next generation. Maybe his tyrant body would have its own passage down the generations at some time in the future. However, it was uncertain whether he would be considered as the ancestor. His tyrant body was far from reaching the great completion level at this time. It was described in the secret book of tyrant body technique that the practitioner would be able to tear apart even the gods and devils with bare hands after they had reached the great completion level. However, the great completion level seemed a bit far-fetched at present. Even so, his physique was already very intrepid. "You're the first person who has managed to injure me ever since I've attained the barbarian god's real body." Qi Tian sneered coldly and said. "I'll be also the first and only person to kill you." The sword in Yi Shiwen's hand let out a metal clanging sound. The tip of the sword suddenly emitted dreadful light rays. He had only intended to show off his ability. And the released sword intention was quite formidable and pressing in nature. Everyone was scared. Yi Shiwen's imposing aura had suppressed everyone. They could even feel it from across a different microcosm. This had left them very scared since it had been coupled with the fact that he had injured Qi Tian a moment ago. Yi Shiwen's overall might and influence had increased a lot as a result. Qi Tian urged the barbarian beast, and it rushed straight towards Yi Shiwen. His lance pierced through the sky, and released countless lance shadows made up of Tao. It streaked across the horizon, and tore innumerable cracks in the sky. All sorts of divine beams fluttered about in the sky. The lance shadows condensed into an image of the barbarian god behind him, and they together went towards Yi Shiwen to suppress him. This was the ancient legendary lance named God Killer Lance. It had been handed down by the ancients, as per the legend. And the barbarian god had once used the set of this lance's technique to slay the gods. It was extremely terrifying. The lance shadows formed a great wall. This was seemingly covered the entire sky. Then, it swept down towards Yi Shiwen to crush him. It seemed as if it would crush Yi Shiwen to death. Yi Shiwen's complexion didn't change one bit. He raised his long sword to welcome the incoming attack. Meanwhile, he unleashed the observing person scripture. The stars began to revolve around in his background. They appeared like the real universe. It seemed as if an ancient voice that had existed since time immemorial was chanting the observing human body as universe scripture, word by word, and phrase by phrase within Yi Shiwen's body. One could even feel the inner essence of great Tao in this chant. Yi Shiwen's display seemed like a glittering river of stars. It was pouring down from the sky. This was Yi Shiwen's self-made move of the observing person scripture. But, it was merely in its development phase, nothing more. However, it was still incredibly dreadful. One side of the sky was covered with an incredible martial art that had once been unparalleled in the ancient world. And, the other side of the sky was covered with a martial art which was created by Yi Shiwen. Then, an astonishing collision occurred in the sky. Rumble. The inexhaustible rays of light transformed into energy waves, and set off violent storms everywhere. The space had already been smashed to pieces. This already shattered space couldn't withstand this collision either. It got smashed even more badly, and scattered. Yi Xuan's sword, just like a galaxy, slashed down upon Qi Tian's body. The four hooves of the barbarian beast couldn't withstand the force, and got fractured. Its forelegs bent, and it crouched down. The hearts of several spectators thumped. They were looking at these two men, and they were dumbstruck. This battle had become too intense. These two men looked like gods to them. The invincible, god-killer lance had wreaked havoc in the past, but it had shriveled in front of Yi Xuan. Actually, its invincible temperament had been gradually chopped down by Yi Xuan, one sword strike at a time. Qi Tian's 999 Dao principles began to revolve around his body in a crazed manner. Each of these Dao principles could easily crush a semi-sage expert to death. This was a terrifying power. Then, Qi Tian unleashed his utmost power. Qi Tian's complexion had turned exceptionally solemn. He had never given much importance to Yi Xuan. In fact, he still felt that he wouldn't have been accidentally wounded by Yi Xuan if he had displayed his full strength from the start. However, his contempt towards Yi Xuan's skill set had vanished. It had been replaced by a dignified look. He had reached the pinnacle of the realm he was in. He effortlessly brandished his lance. The lance tore open the space along with an ear-piercing sound. The sky couldn't endure this attack, and got smashed into pieces by the lance energy. It was an extremely terrifying scene. It looked like the doomsday. Yi Xuan's imposing aura was rising unceasingly. His 999 Dao principles soared up, and began to revolve around his body. Yi Xuan sneered and spoke, "Is this all you've got?" Qi Tian's imposing aura had already reached the peak of his level. However, Yi Xuan's imposing aura was still rising unceasingly. So, it became difficult for Qi Tian to conceal the look of panic in his eyes. How's this possible? How's his aura still rising? Qi Tian had believed that his aura had already reached the peak of the semi-sage realm, and couldn't have risen any further. However, Yi Xuan made him realize that he was gravely mistaken. It was Yi Xuan who had reached the peak, not him. Yi Xuan's aura didn't continue to rise all the way. It was still one step away from reaching its peak condition. But, he didn't wish to reveal his entire strength. Buried Heaven Sword. Yi Xuan's sword slashed out a galaxy. The seemingly endless void got chopped into two halves by the sword energy. The terrifying force struck down towards Qi Tian to crush him. It was like a thunderbolt. How could Qi Tian be willing to resign without a fight? His lance went piercing through the horizon, and erupted. The force with which the energy was released by this intense eruption was incredible. It seemed as if it had arrived straight from the wilderness. Bang! Terrifying shock waves swept out swirling in the air from the collision point of the two weapons. Puff! Qi Tian spouted a mouthful of blood. This was a result of the internal injuries that had been caused by the shock. Everyone was nearly scared to death. Yi Xuan's strength was intrepid, to a dreadful extent. Most people had never seen anyone damage Qi Tian's internal organs. One must know that they wouldn't have been baffled if someone of a higher level had injured him. After all, there were certainly more tyrannical persons than him out there. However, he had been injured by the dreadful power of a person of his rank. Something like this had never happened. Crunch! The barbarian beast's two hind legs couldn't withstand any longer, and fractured. It screamed loudly, and fell to the ground. Yi Xuan made another sword strike at this time. And, his long sword fluttered among the stars like a dragon. Clang! The long sword struck the tip of the lance. The intense sword energy released its suppression effect on Qi Tian. His long hair had been left to flutter in the air by the sword strike. Bloody scars appeared on his tough skin even though it was supposed to be as hard as iron and gold. This had been caused by the crushing impact of the tyrannical sword. Blood splashed out from the hand in which Qi Tian held the lance. This had been caused by the tremendous power of the sword attack. Even his mount's body got cracked as a result. Qi Tian promptly left his mount. He now stood on the ground, and held the lance in his other hand. He coldly looked at Yi Shiwen. He had become extremely vigilant in his heart. Yi Shiwen's performance had been incredible so far. He had resorted to extreme methods in response. However, Yi Shiwen had still turned out to be far more dreadful. It seemed as if there was no bottom line to his strength. Each of his sword strikes turned out to be far more tyrannical than the previous one. Each sword strike was more tyrannical than the other. So, Qi Tian would soon get chopped in half if he allowed Yi Shiwen to make such sword strikes again and again. In fact, he wouldn't even get a chance to fight back at this rate. Such a power, which had a gradient rise, was bound to be baffling for a person like Qi Tian whose forte had been the use of brute force. This was actually Yi Shiwen's highly perfected, cold moon beheader, technique, and its essence was integrated with his swordplay. There was no longer the limitation of using just one sword style in a sword strike for the current Yi Shiwen. Basically, he had grasped many sword styles, and they were all at his fingertips. In other words, he could readily use the essences of thousands of different sword styles in one sword attack. Yi Shiwen had already achieved such a dreadful position. He continued to unleash one sword strike after another, and the cumulative power of the sword attack grew dramatically as a result. And, it seemed as if Qi Tian would be chopped into two halves any time. The sword struck Qi Tian's barbarian beast. It was already in a seriously injured state. It collapsed on the ground. However, Yi Shiwen didn't stop. His long sword fell down from the sky like a stream of Star River. It appeared similar to a perpetually flowing river. Qi Tian suddenly noticed some change in the flow of river. An endless stream of stars suddenly burst out from a certain point in the universe. They didn't seem just like a galaxy, but they also looked like a perpetually flowing river. Bang! Yi Shiwen's sword struck upon Qi Tian's lance. And, blood splashed out from Qi Tian's hands. His palms were badly injured, and had been covered with blood. The flesh on his hands had been ruptured by this terrifying force. This was the first sword strike. Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. It was then followed by the second sword strike. It exploded into brilliant rays of light, and they swept across in a flash. Yi Shiwen then brandished yet another sword strike. He didn't give Qi Tian any chance to respite. Each of these sword attacks was more tyrannical than the other. It seemed as if these sword attacks were cumulative and superimposing in nature. Clang! The sound of the collision of metals was mixed with the sound of breaking bones. The bones in Qi Tian's hands had been broken by Yi Shiwen's sword attack. How's this possible? The Fire Cloud Cave's lord was seated on one of the 4 thrones that had been placed on top of the tall platform hidden among the clouds and mist. He suddenly stood up from his throne with a look of disbelief in his eyes. He had helped Qi Tian build his barbarian god's real body. Therefore, he clearly knew how dreadful this barbarian god's real body was in reality. He himself possessed the barbarian god's real body. This kind of strong physique was truly scary. Even the strongest barbarian beast of the southern barbarian region wasn't a match for the barbarian god's real body when it came to pure competitive strength on the same cultivation realm. The toughness of this physique was top-notch. However, Yi Shiwen had overwhelmingly routed Qi Tian's counterattacks by using brute strength alone. And, the shock generated from his sword attack had even broken his hands. This scene was seriously too scary. Qi Tian snorted in a distressed state. He frantically retreated in order to dodge the next wave of Yi Shiwen's attacks. However, how could Yi Shiwen allow him to have his wish? His sword slashed towards him. Qi Tian had no means to resist Yi Shiwen's attack this time. Don't do it! An extremely vigorous and forceful shout sounded inside the microcosm. However, Yi Shiwen's sword didn't stop. It vigorously slashed down. Puchi! Qi Tian had been cleft into 2. The blood splashed, and bits of his flesh and blood splattered across. Chapter 452. Silence. There was pin-drop silence. Nobody had anticipated that this could be the outcome. Qi Tian had been overbearing. He had suppressed the peers of his generation of the Fire Cloud Cave in order to participate in this competition. So, he had arrived here with the thought of winning this championship. The owners of Barbarian God's real body had become champion many times in the past. However, he had been killed by Yi Xuan's sword. It was an extremely miserable situation. The Barbarian God's real body had won this championship countless times in the past. They at least hadn't been killed even if they hadn't won the championship. And none of them had been crushed like this, without having any power to fight back. Yi Xuan had nearly made the history in this generation. This generation's Barbarian God's real body wasn't the weakest, just like the Barbarian God's real body of the past generations. It was above average to say the least. However, Yi Xuan had swept him away as if he was nothing, and had eventually killed him. In fact, Qi Tian couldn't even match Yi Xuan, apart from the beginning of the battle when they were probing each other's strength. Good. Very good. The complexion of the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave had turned grim. He sat down after he had watched this scene in front of him, and had spoken with a sneer. The Supreme Lord of the True Martial University still had no expression on his face. Nobody knew what he was thinking. He was neither happy nor angry. However, the face of the Lord of Muddy Sky Island exposed the trace of a shocked expression. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Xuan could have such strength. However, a calm expression quickly got restored on his face. He still had a lot of confidence on Emperor Chen. After all, Emperor Chen possessed the spatial ability. So, he already stood at the invincible position. Yi Xuan was certainly very powerful. And, he had acquired a whole new level of respect and admiration in his eyes by now. However, he wasn't anxious even now. The Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall was seated beside him. He seemed to be feeling very disgusted on the contrary. It seemed as if he had eaten a cockroach. His facial expression had turned ashen. He had been extremely excited a moment ago. He had even gone out of his way to say that Yi Xuan wouldn't be able to win, and that all the experts of the True Martial University would be eliminated from the competition. However, he hadn't anticipated that Yi Xuan would give a tight slap on his face not long after this declaration of his. In fact, Yi Xuan had shown him stars in bright daylight. He had also said that Yi Xuan wasn't a match for Qi Tian and would get killed. However, the situation had reversed. Yi Xuan hadn't died. Rather, Qi Tian had. Moreover, Yi Xuan had displayed formidable fighting strength. So, he had gotten scared in his heart. He wasn't calm and composed like the Lord of the Muddy Sky Island because Twin Stars brothers didn't possess spatial ability like Emperor Chen. So, they weren't standing at the invincible position like Emperor Chen. Yi Xuan had won. So, the Twin Stars brother would face Yi Xuan in the next fight if they would also win this round. This had already been decided by the competition's chart. The more formidable strength Yi Xuan would reveal, the more dangerous that would be for the Twin Stars brothers. The complexion of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord turned exceptionally ugly as he thought about this. I hadn't expected that Yi Xuan would win. What did you not expect? Each of these Heaven's Pride expert is more powerful than the other. It's quite normal for any of them to win. Who knows what kind of strength they must be hiding deep down. Had you thought that Emperor Chen would possess spatial ability before his fight with Qin Wang? You hadn't thought that Yi Xuan could effortlessly defeat Qi Tian. But, he ultimately killed him. Yeah. Qi Tian and Qin Wang were completely different from each other. Qi Tian had been ranked below the Xian Yuan Twin Stars brothers and Emperor Chen. However, Yi Xuan has managed to defeat him in an effortless manner. Yi Xuan's strength is truly intrepid. In fact, it's simply beyond your imagination. And, just look at him. He looks quite relaxed. It's obvious that he hasn't used his full strength. So, it's too early to say who would win this competition. The disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave felt extremely disheartened after they witnessed the death of Qi Tian at the hands of Yishuan. The Fire Cloud Cave's run in this competition had come to an end along with Qi Tian's defeat. Yishuan had smoothly entered the semi-finals after he had killed Qi Tian. He had now become one of the top 4 contenders, while Qi Tian had gotten eliminated from the competition in the quarter-finals. And most importantly, the disciples of the Fire Cloud had seen this battle with their own eyes. Yishuan hadn't used any tricks. He had thoroughly defeated Qi Tian using pure strength. This had left them speechless. They obviously didn't wish to admit this. However, they couldn't say anything against Yishuan at this time. Yishuan had thoroughly established his might and influence in this fight. Nobody dared to look down upon him anymore. Initially, people were only talking about Emperor Chen or Xian Yuan twin stars brothers when they were debating the winner. However, they must add Yishuan in that list now. Moreover, the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers were Yishuan's next opponents. The list of the 4 semi-finalists was out. In fact, Yishuan wasn't the one to end this round at the earliest. Rather, it was Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen's opponent was Sea Demon Jin Wushang. Both of them belonged to the same sect. Therefore, these 2 men didn't fight. Sea Demon Jin Wushang merely laughed and surrendered. The fight didn't even take place. Consequently, Emperor Chen won the fight at the earliest. This was followed by Yishuan. He had effortlessly defeated the incredibly strong Qi Tian. Everyone had been very optimistic about the Xian Yuan twin stars in their fight against Han Bingwang. However, they had to struggle a lot. He had always been low-key and mysterious. Even more so than Yishuan. However, it was hard to get hold of him. And, he disappeared right after his fight ended. He had displayed tyrannical strength this time. The Xian Yuan twin stars brothers had to go through a lot of trouble in this fight. The microcosm had nearly collapsed under their fight. They had eventually managed to defeat Han Bingwang. However, they couldn't kill him. In fact, several people said that the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers wouldn't have been a match for Han Bingwang if they had challenged him 1-to-1 instead as a team. This rumor made the most noise. Even more so than Emperor Chen, even though he had advanced easily after Sea Demon Jin Wushang had surrendered, or Yishuan who had effortlessly defeated Qi Tian. In addition, Emperor Chen had easily crushed Qin Wang in the previous round. That was also the first time a Heaven's Pride expert had been defeated. But, it could be said that the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers had to face a lot more difficulty to reach the semi-finals compared to Emperor Chen and Yishuan since they had won effortlessly. And, it could be said that the presence of Yishuan could increase the obstacles on the twin stars brothers' way to win the championship. Many people were secretly gambling in the true martial university. The rate of Yishuan's victory had already surpassed that of the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers. This also indirectly meant that everyone wasn't optimistic about the victory of Xian Yuan twin stars brothers anymore. It was even more so because the semi-finals were tomorrow, and the 4th semi-finalist was a dark horse. Nobody had heard of him. He was a disciple of the true martial university. His strength was equal to a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert's. It must be said that he was very lucky that he had reached till here. The debate on who would win and who would lose had become even more intense after the competition had reached the semi-finals. The underground gambling houses had especially turned even livelier. These underground gambling houses had the support of a myriad of forces of the true martial university behind them. Hence, the higher authorities had turned a blind eye to them even though they operated in public. Come, we are going to start now. Bet on Yishuan. The rate is 1 if he wins, and 1 if he loses. Bet on the Xian Yuan twin stars. The rate is 1 if they win, and 1.5 if they lose. A disciple was announcing the biggest handicap bet on the Metropolis Martial Peak. Many disciples were watching him attentively, and were watching the other disciples place their bets. The disciples were present in the surroundings also went ahead and placed their bets. The disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave, the Muddy Sky Island, and the Xian Yuan Palace Hall were also among them. However, the majority were the disciples of the True Martial University. Almost all the disciples of the True Martial University had unanimously bet for Yi Shiwen's victory. Yi Shiwen was the only Heaven's Pride expert of the True Martial University who was still in the competition. Another disciple of the True Martial University was also in the competition. However, they could tell that he wasn't a match for Emperor Chen. The strength of a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert was way below Emperor Chen's. In fact, the difference was so huge that the betting for Emperor Chen's semi-final match didn't even open. There wasn't any suspense in that battle. The dealer would go bankrupt if he were to open the betting for that match. In other words, it was certain that the finals would take place between Emperor Chen and Xian Yuan Twin Stars brothers or Yi Shiwen. And that was dependent on the battle between Yi Shiwen and the Twin Stars brothers. However, it was evident from the odds that everyone was more optimistic about Yi Shiwen's win. However, the disparity between them wasn't very big. Many people had also bet on the Xian Yuan Twin Stars win, especially the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace. Nearly all of them had unanimously bet on the Xian Yuan Twin Stars win. They were determined to have their revenge on Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen's rank had progressed by one position after he had effortlessly defeated Qi Tian. He was now second only to Emperor Chen. I placed my bet on the Xian Yuan Twin Stars. They've come very far. That Yi Shiwen is like a feather in front of them. He's just an upstart, a disciple of Xian Yuan Palace Hall spoke angrily. The Xian Yuan Twin Stars used to be everyone's favorites to win the competition until Emperor Chen hadn't displayed his formidable fighting strength. After all, they are two men fighting as a team. So, they had been hot favorites to win this competition. However, Emperor Chen had become everyone's favorite after he had displayed his spatial ability. It would be a lie if Emperor Chen had become everyone's favorite. After all, he had displayed the spatial ability. He stood at the invincible position as a result. So, this was quite normal. However, Yi Shiwen was nothing. He had only defeated Qi Tian, that's all. In fact, Qi Tian had been placed below the Xian Yuan Twin Stars in the rankings. So, Yi Shiwen's name didn't have to be placed above the Xian Yuan Twin Stars even if he had defeated Qi Tian. The Twin Stars brothers were two individuals at the end of the day. However, even that Xian Yuan Palace Hall disciple might not have noticed when his confidence on the Twin Stars brothers and his expectations with them had got stuck to only one point. The Xian Yuan's Twin Stars were two men, and Yi Shiwen was alone. Initially, he had thought that they were powerful enough as a team to sweep away their peers. However, he suddenly felt that having more number of people wasn't advantageous anymore. Emperor Chen had used his spatial ability to defeat Qin Wang's counterattack with ease. And, Yi Shiwen was so tyrannical that he defeated Qi Tian effortlessly. Both of them had displayed top-notch strength that was far above their peers. However, people generally talked about the 2-to-1 accomplishments when it came to Xian Yuan Twin Stars. They had greatly benefited from this thus far. However, people were still not very optimistic about them. When did they get reduced to such an extent? Chapter 453. The complexions of the Xian Yuan's Twin Stars brothers had turned ashen when they saw this scene unfold at the gate of the gambling house. This situation had appeared right after their fight. They, like everyone, had abandoned them. They felt like they had been thrown away like a pair of tattered shoes, as if they were of no use whatsoever. Yi Shiwen, it's because of that Yi Shiwen, the Twin Stars brothers clenched their teeth and spoke up in unison. Their complexions had turned sinister. So, it is the Xian Yuan's Twin Stars brothers, a somewhat mocking voice sounded from behind them. They turned around to look, and saw a young man clad in cyan-colored clothes. He was looking at them with a bright smile on his face. Yi Shiwen, it's you, the Twin Stars brothers shouted angrily. They had identified this man. And, it was none other than Yi Shiwen. I didn't expect to see you here. I guess it's true that enemies often cross each other's path, Yishuan faintly laughed and said. Then, he walked past the twin stars brothers. The complexions of the twin stars brothers turned pale as they saw Yishuan. They clenched their teeth so tightly that it seemed as if they would break down. They glared at him with extreme hatred. This was a huge humiliation for them. They wouldn't have faced such humiliation if Yishuan hadn't been there. This was even worse than death for them. However, they had no choice but to watch helplessly as Yishuan walked past them. They couldn't do anything. They could only watch him walk past them. However, they couldn't see that Yishuan had secretly clenched his fist to guard himself against any sudden attack. He was prepared. In fact, he would have killed them on the spot if they had attacked. However, they didn't attack in the end. So, Yishuan relaxed. However, he was also somewhat disappointed. Can I bet? Yishuan walked up to that disciple, who was managing the betting, and asked. Brother Yi? That disciple couldn't believe his eyes when he saw Yishuan here. Of course. Even a person like Yishuan wanted to bet. What could one say about the others? I bet on my own victory. Yishuan calmly said. That is natural. How much does Brother Yi wish to bet? The disciple asked. Yishuan would obviously bet on his victory. That was a given. That disciple knew that very well. There was no doubt about it. 3 million primary spirit dawn. Yishuan replied. What? 3 million primary spirit dawn. That disciple was suddenly dumbstruck. An ordinary semi-sage expert would belong to the very rich category if he had 100,000 primary spirit dawn. And, those who had more than 1 million primary spirit dawn were rarely found in the semi-sage realm. Let alone 3 million primary spirit dawn. There wasn't any other person in the semi-sage realm who could have so many primary spirit dawn, apart from Yishuan. There were many people who had a wealth of more than 1 million primary spirit dawn. However, that also included different kinds of divine tools and heavenly treasures. Only Yishuan could have such courage to throw away an astronomical amount of 3 million primary spirit dawn, apart from the sage experts of course. Moreover, any rare personality who had accumulated so many primary spirit dawn wouldn't dare to bet the entire amount in one go. That's because one would lose everything if they lost the bet. Such a huge loss would be enough for a semi-sage expert to commit suicide. Yes. 3 million primary spirit dawn. Yishuan confirmed. The onlookers gasped in admiration as they looked at Yishuan. They couldn't believe that he had bet 3 million primary spirit dawn on his own victory. It indicated that he was very confident. Yishuan looked calm. Not because he had a lot of confidence in himself, but because he had no other choice. He had to go all out no matter whether it was against the Xian Yuan twin stars or Emperor Chen. There could only be two outcomes. Either he would kill both of them, or one of them would kill him. These primary spirit dawn would be of no use for him if he were to get killed. However, he would obtain an astronomical amount of primary spirit dawn if he were to succeed in killing them. He would obtain two major rewards as a result. One was an amount of more than 10 million primary spirit dawn he'd get if he won the bet, plus a reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn which he'd get from the Jade Yang Peak. Then, he would get rid of the future problem of the shortage of primary spirit dawn in fell swoop. That's all. That disciple thought that he wouldn't reject any bet irrespective the amount. After all, Yishuan was a guest at the moment. He was more dazzling than everyone else, but there was no reason to turn him away since he was a guest. I wish to bet 500 primary spirit dawn. Put 100 under my name. I want to bet 1,000. The disciples who were merely waiting and watching until now also stepped forward and started to place their bets once they saw that Yishuan was so confident about himself. Yishuan was practically the biggest party involved in this gamble. However, he had dared to bet 3 million primary spirit dawn on his own victory. Therefore, they had no reason to not bet. The disciples of the true Martial University especially contributed even more generously in Yishuan's favor. On the contrary, the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall got very depressed when they saw the true Martial University's disciples betting before their eyes. They said, "Humph! All of you will cry bitterly soon." These disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall looked towards the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers. The two of them were standing at the gate. They were expecting these two brothers to declare their position as well. These disciples would like to support these two brothers if they would compete against Yishuan in this aspect. In fact, these disciples wouldn't mind even if they lost some money over this gamble. After all, they belonged to the same force as these brothers. The Xian Yuan twin stars realized that everyone was staring at them. They didn't know why, but they immediately felt a bit depressed. They imagined themselves throwing away several million primary spirit dawn recklessly. However, the very thought of it paralyzed them. After all, it wasn't a few million spirit stones. It wasn't a few million spirit dawn. It was a few million primary spirit dawn. They wouldn't be worth so much even if they were to sell themselves off. These two brothers had the combined wealth of merely 1 million primary spirit dawn. And, their divine tools and heavenly treasures were included in that wealth. So, they wouldn't be able to surpass Yishuan's bid even if their entire wealth would be converted into primary spirit dawn. They differed significantly from Yishuan in terms of wealth. They would only see themselves become a laughing stock in front of everyone even if they were to throw away everything they possessed. And then, they would end up being ridiculed by Yishuan. They would hardly obtain any benefits from it as a result. Their state could only be described as depression. After all, from where did Yishuan obtain so many primary spirit dawn? The true Martial University wouldn't have given him so many primary spirit dawn even if he was a Heaven's Pride expert. That was simply irrational. They thought that Yishuan must have obtained some rewards from the true Martial University. After all, their income mostly came this way. However, they didn't know that Yishuan had obtained the majority of his wealth through a myriad of methods. It wasn't given to him as a reward by the university. Yishuan's energy consumption was huge. How could his cultivation speed have been so fast if he had only depended on the university's rewards and monthly income? He would have been lingering in the half-step legendary realm even now if he had depended on the university alone. They felt like throw away a huge amount too. However, they would be embarrassed in front of Yishuan if they couldn't surpass the mark of 3 million primary spirit dawn. The two brothers shared their feelings with each other. They then came to a mutual decision, turned around, and left. They ignored the ardent gazes of countless disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall behind them as they left. Their ardent looks couldn't make these two brothers to lose face in front of everyone. Yishuan, you'll regret this, the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers gritted their teeth in rage as they spoke. They ferociously thought that they must humiliate Yishuan in the battle. The disciples of the true Martial University made a huge noise as soon as they saw the twin stars brothers retreat in defeat. They had faced a lot of taunts and scorching satires from the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall due to these twin stars brothers. They had been insulted even more after the defeat of Qin Wang and Han Bin Wang. However, they were feeling proud and elated at the moment. What's great about the twin stars brothers? What's rich about them? This is what it means to be rich. Whom are they calling an idol? This is how an idol should be. Yishuan had thrown away 3 million primary spirit dawn in one breath. Whoever dared to challenge him would get a slap on their face. This was 3 million primary spirit dawn. Many sage experts didn't have such wealth. Perhaps Yishuan would have drawn several sage experts to trail behind him if he had revealed his wealth at a place other than the true Martial University. It might be an astronomical wealth for other people. However, even this amount of primary spirit dawn was insufficient to cultivate to the sage realm as far as Yishuan was concerned. His strength was very tyrannical. However, this was truly an endless pile of primary spirit dawn. This statement was no exaggeration. Yishuan could do anything in this world with so many primary spirit dawn in his hand. This wasn't a joke. He could match the speed of exceptional talents in making breakthroughs as long as he had a guaranteed supply of primary spirit dawn. He could even surpass those Heaven's Pride experts without any problem. Many disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall became very depressed as they saw the Xian Yuan Twin Stars brothers leave. And they had no choice but to leave dejected as the cheering voices and mocking laughters of the true Martial University's disciples turned louder. On the other side, the complexions of the disciples of the Muddy Sky Island and the Fire Cloud Cave had become complicated as they saw this scene. It could be said that there were negligible grudges between them and the true Martial University, especially when compared to the hatred between the Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the true Martial University. The disciples of the Muddy Sky Island had a lot of confidence on Emperor Chen. It didn't matter to them how strong Yishuan was. Many people among the disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave were watching Yishuan with immense hatred. Yishuan had killed Qi Tian. And they had lost their hope of winning this competition because of that. They had been turned into mere spectators among the four forces as a result. They could only see the fight between Yishuan and the Xian Yuan Twin Stars and Emperor Chen. However, Yishuan didn't care. He had prepared himself for these things when he had decided to kill his opponents to win this championship. The so-called the taller trees in a forest are always the first to be blown by the wind. However, it was finally the time to see what was stronger, the wind or the forest trees. Not being infected by jealousy was mediocrity. The news about Yishuan spending 3 million primary spirit dawn in the gambling house had quickly disseminated everywhere. However, this was merely an interlude in comparison to the long period of oppressive and intense atmosphere that followed. And it became merely another topic for gossip during leisure time. The competition between Yishuan and the Twin Stars brothers was about to take place in this tense atmosphere. Chapter 454. The competition among four forces had entered the semifinals. Only 4 participants were left. Everyone was paying attention to the news surrounding both the fights at first. However, their attention had mainly started to get focused on Yishuan's fight. They wanted to know if that would be an interesting fight or not. And this was because Emperor Chen's opponent was too weak. The debate on whether Yishuan was more powerful or the Xian Yuan Twin Stars were stronger had continued ever since they had been paired opposite each other. Yishuan had displayed tyrannical strength. However, Twin Stars brothers were 2 individuals. And each of them was powerful enough to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert. Their combined strength could scare a person to death. The people would finally get the answer today. But the supporters of each side hadn't yielded to the other side until now. However, it wasn't the time to decide this verbally anymore. Words had no importance now. Only an all-out battle could decide who was stronger. Several disciples had arrived early in the observation microcosm to watch the fight. And the 4 supreme leaders of the 4 forces had also arrived on time above the tall platform. Each of these 4 forces had lost a great amount of experts in the competition so far. Especially, the true Martial University had lost a peak Heaven's Pride expert named Qin Wang. And the Fire Cloud Cave had lost its only Heaven's Pride expert. However, they must attend the competition no matter how depressed they were. Moreover, their hearts were quite stable. The casualties of these young experts hadn't exceeded their expectations. They would take part in the competition every time in order to win the championship. However, they also came prepared for serious losses. Yishuan had arrived early in the arena today. He was the first one to enter the microcosm. He was calmly waiting for the Twin Stars brothers to arrive. The Twin Stars brothers were surprised to see Yishuan when they arrived. They became somewhat baffled at this. They had collected more and more information on Yishuan as he became more and more famous recently. Some of the information was also about his habits. Yishuan was habitual of arriving late at any place. However, he had unexpectedly arrived early this time. Yishuan, you have come so early today. Are you in a hurry to die? The twin stars brothers said as they looked at Yishuan. Then, they suddenly burst into laughter. Yes, I'm in a hurry. But, I'm in a hurry to kill you. Yishuan refused to yield, and replied. Someone like you will kill us, the twin stars brothers sneered and said in unison. Well, you never know until you give it a try. Yishuan replied solemnly. It seemed as if whatever they had said had been completely irrelevant to his ears. The complexions of the twin stars brothers had turned callous. They were observing Yishuan. Then, they suddenly surrounded him from both sides. The two brothers looked exactly the same. The only difference was that one had red-colored beard, and the other one had blue-colored long hair. Both of them were handsome appearance-wise. They were tall and slim. A strange light was flashing in their eyes. The powerful energy surged up in their entire bodies. A part of their imposing auras soared up into the sky. Both of them were dreadful experts. Yishuan merely let out a faint smile. His golden divinities began to boil under his feet. A burst of golden waves swept out like mighty waves, and he started to surf on them. You say, who do you think will win this fight? The fight had not begun yet. However, a group of disciples had already begun to make speculations. I guess Yishuan will win. After all, he's so formidable. He had defeated Qi Tian effortlessly. These Xian Yuan's twin stars aren't even worth mentioning. I don't agree with you. After all, Qi Tian was ranked below the Xian Yuan twin stars. And most importantly, they are two individuals. Moreover, one of them possesses the fire spirit, and the other one possesses the water spirit. Such types of physiques don't even appear once in thousands of years. These are also a kind of special physique. They were born with the principle of water attribute and the principle of fire attribute. These are extraordinary principles. These two principles generally repel each other. However, these principles have become compatible with each other since they are twins. A mixture of water and fire would have boundless might. However, no one has been able to compel them to collaborate so far. I hope Yishuan can do that. Attack! The elder brother Huaqi attacked this time. He didn't use any weapon. He merely shot his fist forward. His fists absorbed the clouds in the sky, and transformed into a pair of two incomparably massive fists. They then pounded towards Yishuan. This pair of fists was glowing with flames, and looked exceptionally terrifying. Yishuan shot his palm upward, and it transformed into a giant golden dragon. It faced upward and roared. Then, it soared upward, and collided with that pair of fists. It seemed as if the area around that pair of fists had transformed into a world of flames. And, the fire principles were twining around the flames. This looked incomparably powerful and profound, as if the ancient god of fire himself was seated within the flames. He was born with the spirit of fire. He had been innately close to the principle of fire attribute. He could feel the principle of fire since childhood. An average person couldn't come close to him in this aspect. The giant golden dragon burst into that world of fire, and collided with that god of fire. Bang! The complementary waves of this collision swept out wantonly. The void got shattered under its effect. It ripped open a crack in the space, and it seemed like a dense spider web had been formed in the sky. Many mountains in the surroundings had been flattened since they couldn't withstand such a terrifying impact. Everyone went in uproar. They hadn't anticipated that the fight would become so terrifying in the beginning itself. Many people saw that this collision had happened between the golden dragon and the god of fire. They clearly saw Huaqi's fist intention and Yishuan's palm intention grappling with each other with all their might. Both of them had comprehended the fist technique and the palm technique to a considerable extent. In fact, they had already comprehended the creative concept. And, the most terrifying thing was that their comprehension of the creative concept was at the peak. This meant that both of them possessed complete understanding of their respective moves. In other words, they could display the moves in their original states. Most sage experts couldn't pull that off. This also meant that both of them were determined to kill each other. They didn't wish to let the opposite party survive. Their attacks were peerless killer moves. The fire god stood up from the ground. His eyes emitted dazzling rays of light. He displayed a set of fist techniques. He stimulated the fire attribute principles of the entire world, and they began to boil. He was the god in the midst of this fire world. He was the ruler of this place. Nobody could disobey the principles laid down by him. His fist pounded on the golden dragon. It seemed as if he would seize the dragon with his bare hands. Roar! The golden dragon faced upwards, and let out a loud roar. Divine dragon flings its tail. Its long tail swept across. Its speed was extremely quick, similar to that of lightning. It swept out within a split second. The fire god didn't get the time to respond, and got hit. The golden dragon had opened a crack in the perfect body of this fire god. The fire god had been whipped away. And he went flying as a result. He had stood firmly on his feet a moment ago. He roared. It was evident that he wasn't willing to give up. The golden dragon once again rushed towards him. It didn't give him any opportunity to breathe. The golden dragon brandished its claws, and displayed the coiling dragon palm. This coiling dragon palm came out in the form of a dragon. This palm attack suddenly inspired the very essence of heaven and earth, and advanced towards the fire god. Bang! The fire god hadn't anticipated that the golden dragon would pursue him closely, and would arrive close to him so fast. He got caught off guard, and that pair of dragon's claws pierced into his chest. Roar! The golden dragon roared, and ripped apart that fire god in the sky. Endless rays of light fluttered about in the sky, and the fire principles wailed. The fire god roared after getting torn into two halves. Then, he died a tragic death on the spot. Puff! Hua Chi suddenly spouted a mouthful of blood, and retreated several steps. The fire god had been an incarnation of his fist intention. Therefore, he suffered a huge psychological rebound when the fire god got torn into two halves after his spirit was annihilated. Everyone stared in utter shock. They were watching this exceptionally quick fight between the fire god and the golden dragon. However, it took only a moment for the outcome of this fight to appear before all. It seemed as if this fight between a dragon and a god had reminded them of the fights between the dragon race and the gods of the mythological era, as mentioned in the legends. These fights had continued since the prehistoric era, and had lasted till the mythological age. It was a grandiose and disastrous fight. It seemed as if it were a reenactment of fight from that era. This battle had only lasted for a moment, but Hua Chi had been wounded within such a short time. This had made the spectators extremely excited. Someone had sustained injury in the beginning of the fight. It clearly meant that both sides were resorting to extreme methods against each other. They had a lot of expectations from this fight. They were excited because they were hoping to see a splendid battle. And, the way it had started was enough to hint that this might turn out to be a battle that would shake the heavens. Yi Shiwen, you'll die soon. Yi Shiwen suddenly heard a loud shout from his back. A blue-colored gigantic foot suddenly stepped down. It seemed as if it would crush him into meat paste. This gigantic foot was as clear as water. It was dazzling with a scary blue color. It seemed like a foot of some god. It seemed as if it would destroy the world, and would extinguish it forever. Of course, it was Hualan's attack. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would turn out to be so terrifying at first. These brothers would always fight together against their opponents. However, they hadn't done so this time, quite simply because they were fed up of other people saying that they could only fight as a team. In fact, many of their Xian Yuan Palace Hall's disciples had become skeptical about them. Could the Twin Stars brothers prevail over a powerful Heaven's Pride expert if they fought one-on-one and not 2-to-1? These two individuals had gone through a lot of troubles when they had faced Han Bing Wang. This had portrayed the Twin Stars brothers like a pair of paper tigers. And, this rumor had spread everywhere. For a moment, it had seemed as if they didn't possess any skill apart from the advantage of having numerical superiority. This had made them extremely angry. They had discussed this with each other. They must fight with Yi Shiwen one-on-one. It would be better if they could kill him alone, and not as a team. In that case, they would be able to wash the shameful stigma attached to them. However, they hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would be so fierce. They had thought that they could block his attacks, just like they had done with other opponents. However, they hadn't anticipated that Hua Qi's fist intention would be shattered by Yi Shiwen's palm intention in this fight. Chapter 455. The outcome of the fight between Yi Shiwen and Hua Qi had been revealed within a short period of time. Nobody had imagined that it would be a checkmate situation at such an early stage. Hua Qi had been injured even quicker than Qi Tian. Hualong gritted his teeth in hatred. Didn't this outcome prove the embarrassing fact that the twin Stars brothers were worse than Qi Tian? It was rumored that they might not have been able to enter the semi-finals if they didn't have the numerical advantage of being twins. This rumor had already been in circulation everywhere. And, they would be embarrassed in front of everyone if they were to be defeated by Yi Shiwen. In fact, it didn't matter even if they didn't get killed because they would be ashamed to death in the end. However, Hualong couldn't bear anymore, and pounded his foot towards Yi Shiwen as soon as he saw that Hua Qi had been momentarily forced back by Yi Shiwen. His foot technique was extremely dreadful. In fact, it was powerful enough to trample the entire world. Yi Shiwen finally moved into action. He was very powerful, but not enough to ignore the might of their attacks. He withdrew to evade Hualong's offensive. He then turned around, and shot his fist upward towards the sole of the foot. It was just pure fist intention. It had no other additional force attached to it. An extremely tyrannical power swept out. The void got shattered by the fist's attack. The void disintegrated, and a huge crack opened as the fist attack went towards the incoming big foot. Rumble. That big foot was ripped apart in the sky by Yi Shiwen's fist attack. Hualong suddenly screamed. His leg had nearly been broken by Yi Shiwen's fist attack. Blood was dripping from his leg, and he was left to scream to no end. However, he had fortunately withdrawn in time. Otherwise, his entire body would have been torn apart by Yi Shiwen. He looked at Yi Shiwen in disbelief. He couldn't believe that Yi Shiwen's body was so intrepid. He had fought with people who possessed strong bodies in the past. Even his own body had the water spirit. Therefore, his own body was extremely tyrannical. He had often used his body to bully and humiliate other people in his previous fights. The spirit of fire and the spirit of water didn't have the traits of an intrepid body. However, they were still far more tyrannical than an ordinary physique type. In fact, it was no less than a case of courting death for an average person to challenge them. However, they had never fought against any well-known special physique. They hadn't given any attention to Qi Tian. After all, he had been effortlessly defeated by Yi Shiwen. So, he was nothing more than a weak loser in their eyes. And, they had thought that any such loser couldn't be compared with them. However, they had realized how strong Yi Shiwen was after they had started this fight. He was like a golden god of war, and possessed dreadful fighting strength. Everyone was stunned. Yi Shiwen had surprisingly wounded both the twin Stars brothers within a short time. Such fighting strength was enough to scare anyone to death. Many people had been quite optimistic about Yi Shiwen before the start of this contest. After all, Yi Shiwen's accomplishments looked more splendid compared to those of the twin Stars brothers. He had effortlessly defeated Qi Tian, a fighter who had been placed third in the rankings. Most people had guessed that the Xian Yuan twin Stars brothers couldn't be Yi Shiwen's opponents. However, they hadn't thought that it would happen so quickly. How's this possible? How can they be wounded so quickly? They really differ by far from Qi Tian. It seems they had earned such a big reputation by fluke, a disciple spoke up in utter disbelief. He couldn't believe that Yishuan had used only one move to wound the twin stars brothers, since these two used to be favorites to win this competition. The complexions of several disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave had turned ugly as they saw the disciple of the Muddy Sky Island who had said this. He had spoken that about the twin stars brothers. However, these words were also demeaning towards the deceased Chi Tian. However, a lot of people acknowledged his words as well. They couldn't understand why the twin stars brothers, who were definitely more tyrannical than Chi Tian as a team, looked so weak in front of Yishuan. Even their performance was much worse than that of Chi Tian's. This had simply subverted their observations regarding these three individuals. Yeah. How there can be such a big disparity between them? This is unbelievable, someone complied in disbelief. What's strange in that? Chi Fifan was also watching this fight from the crowd. He sneered and continued, that's right. The twin stars brothers are more powerful than Chi Tian as a team. However, they aren't fighting as a team at the moment. These two idiots don't understand that they become extremely powerful when they attack together. But, they are nothing if they attack separately. Chi Fifan had stated the truth. Even he could have killed them effortlessly if he were to fight with any one of them. The twin stars brothers were very ferocious when they fought as a team. Elites such as Yishuan and Emperor Chen wouldn't be afraid even if they had to face two Heaven's Pride experts at once. This was so because 1 + 1 didn't necessarily mean 2. However, the twin stars brothers were different. They were twins. Their hearts were connected to each other. So, their collaborated attacks carried endless might. They had the means to be ranked among the top Heaven's Pride experts, and they were counted as one. However, these so-called powerful twin stars brothers were nothing more than an ordinary lamb when separated. Even Chi Fifan was quite powerful. He hadn't participated in this competition. However, his strength might not be less than that of Qin Wang. In fact, he was confident that he could compete against Emperor Chen if the man didn't use the spatial ability. He was unable to participate in the competition. However, he had been watching it since the beginning. He had confidence in Yishuan. Only he had seen how Yishuan had slaughtered two Heaven's Pride experts in a breath. One must understand that a Heaven's Pride expert was 100 times more heroic and powerful than a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert. Nobody could rival Yishuan's aggressiveness. And, he hadn't even displayed his entire strength so far. He could even find some means to deal with Emperor Chen. The two brothers realized that they couldn't deal with Yishuan separately after they had faced his extremely powerful attack. They had tried to do so a moment ago, but they had soon understood that it didn't matter how high-handed they thought of themselves. They couldn't even withstand one blow his attack. Both the brothers let out huge roars in unison, and decided to launch an attack at Yishuan. However, how could Yishuan let them succeed in their plan? He shot his fist towards Hua Qi to kill him. It seemed as if his fist would break down the world into pieces. A pair of strong iron-like fists pounded towards him. His fist attack far more gorgeous than Hua Qi's fist attack from a moment ago. And, it carried endless might. It then went straight towards Hua Qi for the kill. Hualan and Hua Qi had planned that they would attack Yishuan first. However, they had lost their rhythm in confusion since Yishuan had attacked first, and had gained an upper hand as a result. Hua Qi could only resist Yishuan's attack. So, he shot a pair of red fists forward to face the incoming fist attack. Rumble. A huge explosion occurred. Those strong fists collided in the sky. The void had been shattered within a split second. The earth trembled endlessly, and the chaos leaked out. A dreadful force swept across, and went swirling in the air. The mountains had been shattered, and reduced to powder by the adverse shock waves. Crunch, a loud sound of breaking of bones sounded. Hua Qi's arms had been broken by Yishuan. He screamed as the blood splashed out and the bone fragments swirled in the air. Bang! Hua Qi was sent flying by the explosion. He then crashed into the ground, and opened a huge crack therein. Brother! Hualan looked at Yishuan with his round and glaring eyes. He had already arrived in front of Yishuan to attack by now. He launched a kick towards Yishuan. His kick set off a monstrous power as it went towards Yishuan's waist. Bang! Huolan kicked Yishuan on his waist. But, only the sound of the collision between metals echoed as a result. It seemed as if he had kicked an iron wall. He felt that his leg had gone numb. Everyone held their breath when they saw this scene. Yishuan's body was far too strong. Even the body of some Heaven's Pride expert would have split into two halves by this kick of Huolan's. However, it couldn't even budge Yishuan. Such strength was too horrifying. Yishuan sneered. He regained his composure, and shot his fist. Rumble, a loud sound of breaking of bones sounded along with a big explosion. Huolan's legs had been smashed by Yishuan. His body also crashed into the ground, just like Huoqi's. Yishuan didn't stop. His aura began to boil. His body moved like a lightning, and he stamped his foot upon Huolan's body. Huolan's body collapsed under Yishuan's attack. His body had been broken into two parts. Even the ground was disintegrated by this attack, and two huge chasms spread far away into the distance. It was an exceptionally terrifying spectacle. Huolan is dead. Everyone was dumbstruck. They had never dreamt that they'd see Yishuan trample Huolan to death. They were more optimistic about Yishuan than they were about these two brothers. However, they still felt that the Twin Stars brothers should have been able to hold their own against Yishuan, even if Yishuan was more powerful than them. They had anticipated that the Twin Stars brothers would be able to retreat even if they weren't as good as Yishuan. And, they would definitely go through a bloody battle before they succumbed to their deaths in the fight. People had expected that Yishuan would have to face great difficulties in killing them. And, there was also a possibility that he might get killed. Such expectations had been playing in their minds. However, Yishuan's performance had undermined their imaginations. Yishuan's fighting strength was far too tyrannical. No. Rather than saying that Yishuan was far too strong, it would be better to say that the Twin Stars brothers' one wrong decision had ruined them. It had cost them their lives. Young brother. An intense, killing intention flashed in Huoqi's eyes. He was burning with rage. However, he had also been blasted into the ground. So, he was also in a bad situation like his brother had been. And, he too had nowhere to go. In fact, things had already gone out of his control. A massive hand, as big as the sky, covered him as it pounded upon him. Rumble. The big hand shattered the entire mountain, and flattened the entire area. Huoqi also got annihilated by this attack. How's it possible? No, the Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall shouted in anger as he saw this scene. He suddenly stood up from his throne. He hadn't anticipated that Yishuan would kill the Twin Stars brothers. This had overturned his calculations, and spoiled his plan. Suddenly, a figure stormed into the microcosm while everyone was still in shock. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.